Chapter 119. Yueheng Restaurant's Roast Duck, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valère novels. Please read from the original source. Faced with that waiting gaze, Chu Lian could only follow Royal Princess Duanjia's instructions, dipping the duck into the sauce, and then putting it into her mouth. Chu Lian. Although the roast duck was so crisp that the surface was covered in oil, the inside was completely devoid of flavor. No wonder they had to dip it in soy sauce and salt. The soy sauce and salt combo could add some taste to the meat, but that was only on the outermost layer. It was worth noting that even the most finely ground salt here was coarser than the table salt of the modern world. She could clearly see every single grain of salt, and the larger crystals arguably made the crispy skin it coated even salter. The meat on the inside was the complete opposite, utterly tasteless. While biting down was like eating a mouthful of salt, chewing was equally horrid. She couldn't taste any duck at all. With this sort of uneven flavor distribution, how could anyone consider this delicious? Chu Lian was used to lighter flavors, and this duck definitely didn't match her tastes. However, Royal Princess Duanjia was watching her, so she couldn't just spit it out. She quickly chewed the piece of duck in her mouth and swallowed it with difficulty. She coughed twice to disguise her disgust. When Royal Princess Duanjia saw her reaction, she asked, "Chu Lu, how is it? Did you like it?" Chu Lian looked up at Royal Princess Duanjia. Although her expression was rather calm, the anticipation of a positive answer in her eyes gave her away. Chu Lian couldn't bear to waste her good intentions, so she tried to gloss over it. "It's okay." Upon receiving an answer she hadn't expected, Royal Princess Duanjia frowned. "Is it tasty or not?" Chu Lian awkwardly smiled. She was already numb to the dreadful food here. Perhaps even the imperial banquets in this darn great Wu dynasty were of this standard. Suddenly, Royal Princess Duanjia's eyes lit up. "Chu Lu, could it be that you know how to make even tastier roast duck?" Chu Lian wanted to say no, but Royal Princess Duanjia quickly followed with, "Don't lie to me, or I'll tell my father that you bullied me." Chu Lian hadn't expected the amiable Royal Princess Duanjia to suddenly behave like a tsundere towards her. Considering Prince Wei's status, and comparing him to her own father, who was simply slacking around in a cushy official job while housing was going into decline, Chu Lian had to give in. The princess dad was too strong for her. If they were to call out their fathers, she would be completely obliterated. Chu Lian replied with a quick turn of wit, "Royal Princess, I can't guarantee that my roast duck is magnitudes better, but it would be at least a teeny bit better than Yueheng Restaurant's roast duck." Chu Lian even held out her right hand and made a pinching gesture to show how tiny the difference would be, with her fingertips almost touching. Royal Princess Duanjia hadn't thought that this little brat in front of her actually knew how to cook roast duck. Her eyes darted about as she thought, "In a few days, I'll send another invite for you to come to my estate. How about we cook roast duck together?" Although Royal Princess Duanjia was proposing this with a straight face, she was laughing her head off on the inside. She knew that this roast duck wasn't all that good. Her fourth brother had actually spent a huge sum to buy the secret recipe for this duck. Now even Chu Lu could make something better than this. What a joke. She definitely had to give fourth brother a piece of Chu Lu's roast duck. Let's see if he'll expire from anger. While indulging in her smug thoughts, Royal Princess Duanjia had completely forgotten that she had been the one who wanted to come to Yueheng Restaurant to eat this roast duck in the first place. However, now that Chu Lian had given it such a poor evaluation, it didn't seem to be as delicious as before, no matter how much she continued eating. Out of all the ways she had tried to imagine how this day with Royal Princess Duanjia would go, Chu Lian hadn't expected them to spend the whole day on eating. Again, she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. The roast duck was the only dish in Yueheng Restaurant that the princess liked, and she didn't think the other dishes were all that good. Since Chu Lian had made her lose interest in eating any more of the roast duck, the two of them just ate a little more of the meal. They did take a liking to the sweet, fragrant fruit wine that Yueheng Restaurant offered, so the two of them drank more of that. Royal Princess Duanjia and Chu Lian chattered on happily in their private room, not knowing that every word was falling into the ears of someone in the room next door. Tang Yin couldn't help but cover his mouth with a hand, his cheeks flushing red as he held back his laughter. In the end, He lost the fight and burst into a fit of coughing. He gave up and laughed outright. The fourth brother that royal Princess Duanjia had mentioned happened to be Prince Jean. He already had an unhappy expression on his face. Those extraordinary azure eyes of his coldly swept over Tang Yin, causing the man in question to abruptly shiver. Tang Yin quickly stopped laughing after receiving that warning glare. He straightened up and put on a serious face as he said, "This lowly official dares to ask fourth prince, how much did you spend on the secret recipe for this roast duck?" Prince Jin's face stiffened, and he shot another flying dagger of a glare at the man. "Tang Yin, do you perhaps feel that you're being paid too much as an official, since you're coming to Yueheng restaurant to spend it all?" Having some intelligence about him, Tang Yin immediately shut up. However, just like royal Princess Duanjia, he didn't feel much like eating the crispy roast duck before him now. He lamented, "This lowly official wonders how skilled the princess friend is at cooking roast duck. This lowly official would like to try some." Prince Jean generously bestowed another cold glare upon him. "Have you gotten addicted to testing your courage?" Tang Yin awkwardly coughed before turning the conversation back to their original topic. "Your Highness, He Sanlang has already reached Liangzhou. These are the letters that he sent." Tang Yin was one of Prince Jin's subordinate officials, as well as one of his trusted advisors. Prince Jin took the stack of letters from Tang Yin, only reading the letter that He Changdi had written to him. The other two letters meant for House Jing'an were kept to one side. He would send someone to the Jing'an estate with them when he reached home. Send a team of men and horses over to Changdi. They are to be at his disposal. Tang Yin nodded. When the two of them were almost done with their business, Prince Jean heard the ladies next door preparing to leave for Defeng Tea House for the show. Remembering He Changdi's words in the letter just now, asking him to take special care of Chu Lian, Prince Jean and Tang Yin also stood up to move to Defeng Tea House in secret. Actually, while writing the words, special care, He Changdi had been gritting his teeth in anger. His brush had been trembling while writing out the words, and he had almost fainted from the force of his rage. Who could know if Prince Jean could sense the conflict and anger in his heart? TL note. The author literally used Sundra, and there's no other translation for it. Don't kill me, XD also. The wiki page for those who need an explanation, https://n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/Sundra. Chapter 120. Playing for the Deaf, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. It was just past 1 p.m. At this hour, Defeng Tea House didn't have much of a crowd, so Royal Princess Duanjia and Chu Lian picked a private room and settled in. It was still an hour before the show would start. At the same time as their arrival, someone else was already sitting in the best private room there was. High on the second floor, the room had a good view of everything happening in the tea house. As he scanned the area, Xiao Bojian's eyes lit up. His deep gaze settled upon the sole person he was waiting for. She had come. Lianer had come. Xiao Bojian tightly gripped his teacup, barely restraining his excitement. The liquid in the cup trembled with his shaking hands. In his agitated state, Xiao Bojian only managed to drink half a sip of tea. Xiao Bojian turned his gaze to the young girl, accompanying Chu Lian. They were about the same height, but there was no mistaking her identity. Upon recognizing her, the smile he hadn't been able to hold back dampened. His narrowed eyes lowered even further. He didn't understand why Royal Princess Duanjia was out with Chu Lian. They even looked like they were close friends, talking and laughing together. Somewhere else in Defeng Tea House, Prince Jean and Tang Yin had already chosen the private room next to Royal Princess Duanjia and Chu Lian's. They were able to settle down without being seen, thanks to their guards. Suddenly, one appeared out of the shadows in Xiao Bojian's private room, respectfully asking, "Master, what are your orders?" Xiao Bojian shot a look in the direction of Chu Lian's private room. Then, he turned to one and whispering something into his ear. One received his orders and left. Within Chu Lian's private room, Royal Princess Duanjia was holding her teacup in her hands, slowly sipping her honey water mouthful by mouthful, bored out of her mind. She looked up at the woman sitting opposite her, and her excitement grew. For some reason, she could get along very well with Chu Lu. Thinking back to the professional tea brewer they had chased out of the room earlier, Royal Princess Duanjia's lips pressed into a smile. Hey, Chu Lu, why don't you like to drink sancha? The taste is too complicated. I don't like it. Most people liked sancha in this time, especially the process of brewing sancha. They like to treat it like an art form, adding all kinds of spices, classifying the various types of tea and determining their different flavors, as if it was something sophisticated. However, Chu Lian had just deemed the entire process too complicated. Like it was silly to fuss over something as small as brewing a cup of sancha. How interesting. Royal Princess Duanjia seemed to think that Chu Lian disliked things because she knew of something better. Chu Lu, what kind of tea is even tastier than sancha? Since Royal Princess Duanjia had asked so eagerly, Chu Lian quickly replied without thinking, Mingqian tea and Yuqian. Even before she had finished speaking, Chu Lian knew she had messed up. She quickly stopped talking. The Great Wu dynasty didn't have any proper green tea at all, let alone the high-grade types of mountain-grown tea like Mingqian tea and Yuqian tea. Hadn't she just put her foot into her own mouth? Chu Lian regretted her words so much. When Royal Princess Duanjia saw that she had stopped speaking halfway, she immediately kept asking, Hey, Chu Lu, you can't just stop like that. What's that Mingqian tea you were talking about? Explain it to me now. Chu Lian had a conflicted expression on her face. How was she supposed to explain it? The Great Wu dynasty didn't even have a proper tea plantation. If she were to explain further, wouldn't the princess turn speechless? While she was worrying over how to explain things to the princess, there was a knock at the door. Royal Princess Duanjia shot a look at her handmaid. A moment later, the handmaid returned, leading a clean-looking waiter into the room. Princess, it's a waiter. He's brought some snacks. Royal Princess Duanjia nodded. The quick-witted waiter laid out Defeng Tea House's specialty confections on the table before carefully taking out a narrow-necked bottle from a box. He then explained in a prim manner, Esteemed guests, this is a complimentary bottle of mead from the tea house. The owner happens to be celebrating a happy occasion today, so every guest will receive a portion. The formula used to brew this mead has been passed down in the owner's family for generations, and the flavor is excellent. Dear guests, would you like to try some? TL note. The tea that Chu Lian mentioned is Longjing tea, which has a few types defined by when they're picked, https://n. Wikipedia. org/wiki/Longjing. Chapter 121. Playing for the Deaf, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Royal Princess Duanjia liked to try new things, but Chu Lian wasn't too interested. However, seeing the curiosity on Royal Princess Duanjia's face, she accompanied her in having a cup. Royal Princess Duanjia nodded. Her handmaid then took a cup of mead and tasted it. After making sure there was nothing wrong with it, she signaled for the waiter to pour more for the two ladies. Chu Lian took a small sip. The mead was sweet and mellow, and even had a hint of grape flavor. She hadn't expected the taste of it to be just like the waiter had described. Excellent. The taste of alcohol was light, so it was perfectly suited for women. It didn't lose out to Yueheng Restaurant's fruit wine at all. When the waiter left the room, Royal Princess Duanjia drank a few more mouthfuls of the mead. Honey water was a little too mild to suit her tastes. Conversely, this mead was just right to her liking. The two of them began to discuss the songs that were performed in Defeng Tea House daily. Just as Royal Princess Duanjia mentioned that the song for today, The Phoenix Seeks His Soulmate, was only performed once a month, a light tinkling could be heard from the main hall. Then, the music began to play. Royal Princess Duanjia ordered her handmaid to open the windows and let down the curtains. From the gaps in the curtains, they looked towards the main hall and saw that the performance had indeed started. Royal Princess Duanjia found it strange and asked, It's not supposed to be time yet, so why has the performance already started? Chu Lian had never come to this tea house before and could only shake her head in confusion. She had no temperament for music at all. The best she could do was tell if the song was nice. If she had to point out why it was nice, she probably wouldn't be able to give an answer, regardless of whether she listened to the song once, twice, or even 10 times. As for tunes or notes, just forget it. Chu Lian took a sip of mead and acted like she understood. In actuality, Who cared if it was the phoenix seeking its mate or the mate seeking its phoenix? It didn't matter to her if the performance time was moved forward, nor did it even occur to her that the song could have a hidden meaning. It was the handmaid by Royal Princess Duanjia's side who gasped in shock. She said quietly, "Princess, third young madam, it seems like it's not the usual performer today." The sounds of music filled with emotion rose through the air. The notes were struck precisely. Just by listening, anyone could tell that the player was extremely skilled at the guqin. Royal Princess Duanjia laughed. A song only played once a month couldn't possibly be performed by the usual musician. Wouldn't they play it all the time if they could? I'm afraid it must be some lovelorn idiot borrowing this chance to confess his love. Royal Princess Duanjia hit the nail on the head. It wasn't the first or second time that someone had used "The Phoenix Seeks His Soulmate" to confess at Defing Tea House. Everyone knew that it was extremely flattering for a lady if she got a confession from a gentleman at Defing Tea House. Chu Lian looked up, her eyes shining. Who could have imagined that a simple song could have such an interesting story behind it? How fun. Women were the same in any time. Once they smelled gossip, their eyes would light up and they would become restless for it. Chu Lian excitedly began to discuss all the old gossip in Defing Tea House with Royal Princess Duanjia. She was completely oblivious to the fact that the receiver of this emotional confession was herself. Xiao Bojian sat before the guqin, making sweet music with his fingertips, carrying his own emotions, hating that he couldn't show his every lingering thought and emotion to that lady. While imagining how touched and infatuated Chu Lian must be, a determined smile gathered on Xiao Bojian's lips. His long fingers elegantly stroked the strings of the guqin. He had assumed that Lianer wouldn't come to their meeting today, so he hadn't had much hope. But who could have expected that she had actually come? In the moment that he saw her, his heart had swelled with indescribable feelings. There was only one thought in his mind. Chu Lian still had feelings for him. Although he couldn't confess his love face to face, by borrowing the power of music, he could let her know of the restlessness in his heart and his longing for her. TL note, "The Phoenix Seeks His Soulmate," or Feng Qiu Huang, is an actual song, and a pretty famous one at that. I found a cool performance of it, but without any subtitles. The guqin is a 7-stringed instrument, similar to the zither. https://en. Wikipedia. org/wiki/guqin. Chapter 122. Playing for the Deaf. 3. While Xiao Bojian was immersed in his overwhelming joy, he couldn't have known that this method of confessing when used on Chu Lian was like playing to the deaf. She hadn't even known that a song like "The Phoenix Seeks His Soulmate" existed until today. So how could she know what the song was trying to express? In the private room next door, Prince Jean and Tang Yin had looks of understanding on their faces. Prince Jean waved over one of his personal guards and instructed, "Go and find out the identity of the player." His azure eyes narrowed together, and his gaze landed on the wall as if it could pierce through and observe the two ladies next door. Which one of them was meant to be the recipient of this love song? It was just past 1 p.m. There weren't many young ladies in Defing Tea House right now. The only ones who had just arrived were House Jinggan's third young madam and Royal Princess Duanjia. After the song was done, Xiao Bojian wrapped up in style and switched with the tea house's usual player. The guard one took this opportunity to return and quietly report to his master that he had successfully carried out his orders. The corners of Xiao Bojian's lips curled up and he nodded. He stood up quickly, striding out to a room where he wouldn't be noticed. Under his wide sleeves, he held tightly onto a plain brocade box. As the music slowly faded, Royal Princess Duanjia nodded a few times. She couldn't help but praise the player. Setting aside the player's looks, there's nothing to criticize about his skills on the guqin. Anyone who can play the guqin to this extent can't possibly be someone unaccomplished. This humble listener has been blessed. Chu Lian couldn't understand her words at all. She could only tell that the song had been played well. However, to someone from the modern world who had heard all sorts of music and even gone to concerts, these ancient guqin songs weren't much. This was the problem of having too wide a worldview. It couldn't be helped. Royal Princess Duanjia shot a glance at the slightly dazed-looking Chu Lian, who was drinking some mead. How could she be so unmoved after listening to such brilliant Guqin music? Curiosity welled up in the princess again as she asked, Chu Lu, what do you think about that person's playing? How could Chu Lian possibly be able to critique that player's music skills? She coughed and tried to go along with what Royal Princess Duanjia had said. It was not bad. Royal Princess Duanjia gaped a little. She had been deceived by Chu Lian's culinary skills before, so she thought that Chu Lian must have hidden her skills in other areas too. However, that wonderful playing had only earned a not bad from Chu Lian. The stubborn princess inwardly decided that she had to play a song for Chu Lian the next time they met. Chu Lian didn't know that her casual comment had inspired Royal Princess Duanjia to play for her. If she had known, she would have rather spoken the truth. Then she wouldn't have to suffer through Royal Princess Duanjia's playing day after day. The two of them were chatting casually when Royal Princess Duanjia suddenly frowned. Her expression contorted. Chu Lian sensed the change and suffered a fright. She quickly asked, Royal Princess, are you okay? Does it hurt anywhere? When questioned, Royal Princess Duanjia flushed red and hurriedly replied, Chu Lu, wait here for me. I'm going to the ladies. Seeing Royal Princess Duanjia seemingly trying to hold back something with difficulty, Chu Lian nodded in quick succession and let her go. Once Royal Princess Duanjia left, only Chu Lian and Shi Yin were left in the room, while Wanlan was standing guard outside. Wanlan was standing ramrod straight outside the room, but her expression suddenly changed. She hadn't had the time to react when a burst of pain struck the back of her neck and she lost consciousness in the next second, collapsing bonelessly against the wall. Xiao Bojian shot a look at the guard next to him, and one quickly hid into the shadows. Xiao Bojian stared at the beautiful silhouette he could see from behind the screen at the entrance of the room, and his heart beat faster. The hand gripping his dagger under his sleeve tightened before he strode forward and passed through the screen. Chapter 123, Meeting 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian held up the cup of mead and took a small sip. Just like the swirling of the golden mead within the snow-white porcelain cup, Chu Lian's heart also slowly lost its calm. She had a faint inkling that what happened just now seemed a little strange. Why would Royal Princess Duanjia suddenly have a stomachache? They had clearly eaten the exact same foods. However, Royal Princess Duanjia's expression hadn't seemed fake. It felt like she had unknowingly landed in someone's net. The more she thought about it, the faster Chu Lian's heart beat. Her face suddenly turned pale. She turned to Shi Yan, who was standing next to her, and was about to mention leaving a little early. However, the moment she turned around, her eyes met with the gaze of Xiao Bojian. Chu Lian's pupils abruptly shrunk, and she was stunned for a moment. Why would Xiao Bojian appear here? Xiao Bojian hadn't expected to meet Chu Lian's gaze the moment he passed the screen at the entrance of the room. The coincidence made it seem like their thoughts were connected. With that thought in mind, his heart couldn't help but melt. Lianer, Chu Lian. How could she have such rotten luck? Darn it. Chu Lian inwardly snapped curse after curse to the high heavens. Nothing good ever happened when she ran into Xiao Bojian. Previously, she had managed to escape him at the Dingyuan estate. But evidently, that luck didn't last for long. She just had to bump into him here. Was the story ever going to let her live her life in peace? She wasn't the original Chu Lian. Deceptively pretty, carnivorous Venus flytraps weren't her type. It was too dangerous to like someone like Xiao Bojian. You wouldn't know when you'd be sold for his own selfish benefits. Although Chu Lian was completely frustrated and unhappy on the inside, after she got over the initial shock of seeing Xiao Bojian here, her heart slowly regained its inner calm. She wasn't the original Chu Lian, who might have gotten flustered over this guy's appearance. Judging from the situation, Royal Princess Duanjia's sudden departure must have had something to do with him. Xian's soul almost left her body when she heard Xiao Bojian's sweet call of Lianer. She turned and stared dazedly at the tall gentleman standing by the screen. Xian had a stronger reaction than Chu Lian. Her entire body stiffened. She couldn't believe that Mr. Xiao had appeared here at Defing Tea House of all places. Furthermore, in Third Young Madam and Royal Princess Duanjia's private room, Chu Lian had already stood up by now. Xiao Bojian's greedy eyes were locked onto her. After so many days apart, he eagerly looked at his lover. She was dressed in a light yellow dress with a light blue outer layer embroidered with flowers. She carried a small green pouch at her waist, together with 1,000 blessings jade amulet. Her fingers looked long and slender. There was a jade green hairpin with gold inlays nestled in her hair, and a ruby headband on her forehead. The peach blossom pattern of the lining suited her complexion well. Xiao Bojian's eyes roamed greedily over her red lips, curved nose, almond-shaped eyes, and rounded cheeks. His fingers stroked the inside of his sleeve, as if he were touching the face of the person before him. Unfortunately, he was only looking at what Chu Lian was wearing, and didn't notice the guarded look in her wide, moist eyes. Chu Lian remained standing in silence as she waited for Xiao Bojian to speak. She wasn't trying to act calm. She knew clearly that she couldn't leave now, no matter how much she wanted to. With how tricky Xiao Bojian was, she highly doubted that he wouldn't have a backup plan. Perhaps Xiao Bojian had finally noticed that the atmosphere was a little tense. He lowered his head, shifting his gaze away from Chu Lian's body. Then, he walked up to Royal Princess Duanjia's vacant seat and sat down without so much as a "by your leave." He realized that Chu Lian was still standing a little stiffly. His brow wrinkled slightly and he called out in a gentle tone, "Lianer, come, sit down." Wouldn't she have sat down already if that was what she wanted? If she had a choice, she would have long left already without turning back. Though these were her true thoughts, Chu Lian still obediently sat down anyway. She lowered her gaze, hiding the emotions in her eyes that were surely different from what he would expect from Chu Lian. TL note: Chu Lian's dress looks kinda like this. Chapter 124, Meeting 2, Lianer. I'm so glad you came today. You must have heard my song, The Phoenix Seeks His Soulmate, just now. What do you think? Xiao Bojian's tone was full of tenderness, and his eyes were soft with affection. However, his words stirred up a wave of emotion in the heart of the woman sitting opposite him. What was going on? Why? Why was Xiao Bojian talking as if the two of them had made plans to meet here at this tea house? She hadn't received any sort of communication from him, though. Was Xiao Bojian pulling a bluff on her? Or had something happened without her knowing? Also, he had been the one playing the song that almost put her to sleep. Bro, you played it well, but I don't even know how to appreciate music like that. Chu Lian wanted to cry. If she had known that something like this would happen, she wouldn't have agreed to go out with Royal Princess Duanjia. Chu Lian's head lowered even further. Her voice was as tiny as a mosquito's as she said, "It was passable." Upon receiving an evaluation like this, Xiao Bojian's disappointment was clearly reflected in his eyes. However, he immediately put on a warm smile again and placed a small brocade box he had been carrying onto the table. Pushing it towards Chu Lian, he said, "Lianer, it's your birthday today. This is a birthday present that I've prepared for you. Open it and see if you like it." Chu Lian shot a glance at the plain brocade box on the table. She tried her hardest to hold back the twitching of her face. What was going on here? Her legitimate husband didn't mention her birthday at all and had probably completely forgotten about it. However, this outsider came all the way up to her just to give her a present. Chu Lian wanted to roll her eyes at the heavens. She took a deep breath and tried her best to let him down gently. "Thank you for your kind thoughts, Mr. Xiao, but I can't accept this gift." Xiao Bojian's breathing slowed. There was a storm whirling in his eyes as he furrowed his brows. "Lianer, Brother Xiao has spent a lot of effort to prepare this especially for you." Xiao Bojian stared tensely at the woman sitting across from him. With her head lowered, he couldn't read her expression at all. He fisted his hands under his wide sleeves, feeling his fingernails pierce into the skin of his palms. "Lianer, why are you so afraid? Why haven't you looked at me yet?" For the second time already, Chu Lian felt like crying. Who wanted to look at this darn pervert? If she could, she would have escaped already. The pressure of facing the book's original male lead, Xiao Bojian, was too much for her. It was much easier to face her crazy husband. "Lianer, since you've come here today, aren't you implying that you still have me, your brother Xiao, in your heart? I know you were forced into these circumstances. Don't worry, leave it all to Brother Xiao. Someday, Brother Xiao will get you out of this." Near the end, Xiao Bojian's voice held a hint of ferocity. The way the vicious expression contorted his handsome features could send chills down anyone's spine. Xian had only caught a glimpse of it. She was so frightened that she ducked down and didn't dare to move again. Chu Lian wanted to knock herself out with a block of tofu. Her heart was full of frustration from her suffering. If she had known that this idiot would be here at Deffing Tea House, she wouldn't have come here even if they beat her to death. Bro, don't be like this. Could you be a little more normal? I'm already married. Although my husband isn't really all that sane and even likes to act out, I have no intention of cheating at all. What's up with you, coming over here all sneaky and silent? Why are you so obsessed with trying to make me commit adultery? Chu Lian pursed her lips and decided not to say anything in the end. She had a hunch that if Xiao Bojian discovered that she wasn't the real Chu Lian, he might go even crazier. Her life could very well be in danger. Thus, it was better to keep a low profile. What kind of mess had the original Chu Lian left for her to clean up? Chapter 125. Meeting 3. Xiao Bojian suppressed the sourness in his heart and forced his face into a gentle, kind expression. Since Chu Lian didn't even want to reach over and accept the gift, he pulled it back towards himself, opened it up, and placed it in front of her again. He put on his warmest, most persuasive tone of voice and said, "Lianer, take a look. It's the golden hairpin with jade inlays that you were eyeing for so long back then. Do you like it?" Chu Lian swept her gaze over it. The hairpin was covered in exquisitely engraved flower patterns. Both the hearts of the flowers and their petals were decorated in high-quality jade. On the head of the hairpin were 5 small sapphires glimmering in the light, forming the largest flower of them all. This accessory was indeed of high value, and it was certainly beautiful. No wonder the previous Chu Lian had wanted over it. Xiao Bojian's expression softened a little, perhaps due to sensing Chu Lian's admiration of his gift. Since his Lianer didn't want to speak, then he could be the one to fill the silence. He had to let Lianer understand the true depths of his sincerity. That damn He Changdi wasn't good enough for her. "Lianer, it's Brother Xiao who was wrong. I should have bought this hairpin for you earlier. After making you wait for so long, why don't you let Brother Xiao put it on for you now?" Chu Lian. She was already at her limit, just trying to keep up her calm facade. What was this guy trying to do now? What the two of them didn't know was that their whole conversation had been heard by Prince Jean in the private room next door. Waves of emotion rippled across the calm lakes of Prince Jean's azure eyes. Xiao Bojian? He hadn't expected Miss Chu to be so daring. Prince Jean instantly felt gratified that he had chosen to follow Miss Chu here. He was also starting to understand why He Sanlang had asked him to keep a watch on this newlywed wife of his. His azure eyes glimmered and the corner of his mouth raised. All this was going to be even more fun now. Chu Lian hurriedly waved away the offer. For the sake of placating Xiao Bojian's anger, she could only say in a small voice, "There's no need for that. I'll just bring it back." After saying so, she picked up the plain brocade box from the table and passed it to Xian, who was waiting behind her. Seeing Chu Lian accept the gift, Xiao Bojian seemed to finally relax and stop trying to put it on for her. "Lianer, wait a little longer for Brother Xiao, won't you? Trust Brother Xiao. It won't take too long." Xiao Bojian stared at the tender, fair little hands that Chu Lian had placed on her knees. He had the urge to take them and cover them with his own large palms so that he could massage them. The more he thought about it, the more tempting it was. He unconsciously kneaded his palms with his fingers. Chu Lian had to resist the urge to glare back at him with all her might. Could this damned Xiao Bojian stop pushing his one-sided feelings on her? Had he ever considered her feelings in the matter? As expected, he was extremely hateful and even more annoying than He Changdi. Xiao Bojian was about to continue speaking when a loud bang resounded from next door. Chu Lian suffered a fright. What followed was the clanging sound of a fight. Chu Lian's expression immediately turned serious as she looked at the wall separating her room from the one next door. Xiao Bojian sat up in his seat, clearly startled by the noise as well. He was more sensitive than Chu Lian. At that exact moment, a man dressed in gray came out from the shadows and walked up to Xiao Bojian. He whispered into Xiao Bojian's ears, seemingly reporting something. The furrow between Xiao Bojian's brows grew more pronounced. He reached out to grab Chu Lian, who was just a short distance away, but the man dressed in gray held him back. The man said, "Master, there's no time. We have to leave quickly. If those people discover us, the consequences will be dire." "But Lianer, Miss Chu is not their target. She'll be fine. Come with me quickly. If you don't leave now, all the years of preparation will be ruined in an instant." Chapter 126. Sudden Change 1. It seemed like the man in gray had finally convinced him. Xiao Bojian pressed his lips together tightly and followed the man out. As he passed by the entrance screen, he couldn't resist turning back to look at Chu Lian, who was still standing by the table. At the same time, Chu Lian just happened to direct her gaze towards him. Their eyes met. In his mind, Xiao Bojian felt like he would never forget Chu Lian's current expression. It was an expression that conjured a piercing pain inside his heart, numbing him to all other feelings. Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes were opened wide, a trace of confusion in their depths. Her eyes were bright and crystal clear, like sunlight shining through glass. There was also a tiny little bit of contempt that she was trying hard to conceal. That's right, contempt. Contempt towards Xiao Bojian. Xiao Bojian felt as if he had been stabbed directly through the chest. His brows furrowed in pain. A layer of frost glazed over his eyes. It froze even his strong, beating heart, turning it into a sculpture so fragile it would shatter at a single touch. He would have rather not understood that look in Chu Lian's eyes then. However, there was still the looming risk of pursuers urging him on. He gritted his teeth and mouthed something to her. Then, in the span of a second, he left without turning back. "Lianer, I've disappointed you this time. Wait for me. I'll definitely make it up to you and give you the best in the whole world." Xiao Bojian disappeared just as quickly as he had appeared. When Xiao Bojian left, a bunch of thoughts ran through Chu Lian's mind. That smidge of contempt in her eyes had not been faked. She really looked down on him. She could surmise from the sudden appearance of Xiao Bojian's subordinate that something bad must have happened in Defeng Tea House, something that would affect even the lives of bystanders. However, at such a dangerous time, Xiao Bojian had followed his subordinate and left all by himself, leaving his beloved Chu Lian behind in Defeng Tea House. Someone who only cared for himself in the face of danger wasn't qualified to be spouting romantic words like that. Chu Lian suddenly pitted the original female lead. By falling in love with and following a man like that, the original female lead would have surely been backstabbed by him someday. After this whole event, Chu Lian felt even more disgusted by Xiao Bojian. She decided that she had to be more careful next time and avoid meeting such a terrifying man in the future. The most important thing right now was to protect herself. Chu Lian didn't want to be someone who could only helplessly await her fate. Luckily, the soul that resided in the original female lead's body was now Chu Lian. Otherwise, how would she have calmly considered all this? It would have been good enough if she didn't lose her wits over that man. Xiao Bojian didn't know that his shameless, lone escape had earned him the label of a self-centered rat, something that he would never be able to remove for the rest of his life. Chu Lian tugged at Xiyin, who had almost lost her soul from the tension just now. "Xiyin, what are you blanking out for? We have to leave now. Didn't you hear what that man in gray said?" Xiyin was only a maidservant in the end. No matter how loyal she was, with everything that had just happened, her spirit had already been completely shattered since Xiao Bojian's mysterious appearance in the private room. After Chu Lian pulled her into motion, she became completely flustered. However, upon seeing how calm third young madam was, she seemed to have found her backbone. She watched Chu Lian closely and forcefully nodded. Chu Lian patted her arm and led her towards the exit. The fighting sounds from next door had become even louder, accompanied by the sounds of porcelain shattering on the floor. Since Chu Lian was in such a rush, the jade amulet she had at her waist got hooked onto the screen and fell to the carpet silently. Chu Lian and Xiyin didn't notice it at all. When she reached the door, she found the unconscious Wanlan. Chu Lian's expression turned solemn. No wonder Wanlan hadn't even warned her about Xiao Bojian's visit. She had already been taken care of. When Xiyin saw Wanlan collapsed against the wall, She almost shouted in fright. However, upon receiving Chu Lian's warning glare, she hurriedly covered her mouth and silenced herself. Chapter 127. Sudden Change 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian and Shi Yin were both women, and their strength was limited. There was no way they would be able to carry the unconscious Wanlan with them. Shi Yin tried her best to suppress her building anxiety, but she couldn't hold back the tremor in her voice as she asked, Third, young madam, what should we do now? Chu Lian looked at the unconscious Wanlan and then back at Shi Yin, who was clearly frightened out of her mind. Her hands clenched into little fists, hidden under her wide sleeves. When she felt her nails dig into the palm of her hands, she forced herself to calm down. Chu Lian didn't reply Shi Yin immediately. Her clear, determined eyes made a sweep of the area outside the private room. When she noticed a rack of basins nearby, she hurried over to it and took up one of the bronze basins. Then, in a single quick movement, she upended the basin, pouring cold water all over Wanlan's face. Chu Lian had no idea if this would work. If they couldn't wake Wanlan up, she and Shi Yin would have to leave first. Perhaps Wanlan's senses were more developed than most due to her martial arts training, because right after the cold water hit her, Wanlan quickly woke up. Her eyelids trembled as she fought to open her eyes. The first thing she saw upon regaining consciousness was Chu Lian squatting in front of her with a solemn expression. Afterwards, it didn't take long to recall what had happened before she had been hit. Wanlan's pupils abruptly shrunk and her eyes turned clear. Worried, she asked, Third young madam, did anything happen to you? Someone ambushed me. Chu Lian let out a sigh of relief and helped Wanlan up with Shi Yin's support. There's no time to explain. Wanlan, we have to leave this place right now. The sounds of combat from the next room hadn't ceased while they were talking. Conversely, it sounded like the fighting was actually getting worse. Chu Lian wasn't sure when the fight would spill over into their room, so it was best to leave right at this moment. With her experience, Chu Lian's words, and the fact that she had been ambushed by someone, Wanlan's reacted quickly after the fuzziness in her mind cleared up. She noticed the situation they were in and understood that third young madam was right. Wanlan's expression turned serious. Third young madam, this servant will head out first in a moment. Please follow behind this servant together with Shi Yin. Chu Lian nodded in acknowledgement. After Wanlan finished speaking, she wiped off the water on her face and took out a whip from where it had been hidden in her belt. She kept it in her hands as she moved. First, she leaned against the door to the room and listened for some time. Then, when she believed it was clear, she signaled over to Chu Lian and Shi Yin. Wanlan carefully opened the door and led them out slowly. It was just after 1 p.m., so there weren't many people occupying the private boxes in Defing Tea House. They didn't see anyone else at all upon leaving their room. Third young madam, let's leave quickly. House Jingen's carriage is at the back of this building. Wanlan whispered a reminder. Chu Lian forcefully nodded. Her heart was beating furiously. Just as she and Shi Yin were about to move, the door behind them burst open with a huge bang. An assassin dressed in black had been kicked out of the room. He took down the doors with him as he landed. Right after, a few men in black appeared suddenly, and the sounds of clashing swords rang out. All of this happened right before their eyes. The assassin who had broken the door was only 2 to 3 meters away from Chu Lian. Her heart thumped even faster. The participants in the fight that had spilled out of the room and into the corridor all glanced in Chu Lian's direction. Cold sweat broke out on the girls' backs as time seemed to freeze. In the next second, 2 masked men in gray and 2 richly dressed men dashed out from the room in pursuit. One of them was wearing a jade crown, protected in the center of the 3 other men. That man's gaze couldn't help but turn towards Chu Lian. Chu Lian's gaze also coincidentally met with his. Azure eyes. A sharp look. Chu Lian's entire body shivered. Tons of details rushed into her mind like a flood. So it was him. Chu Lian stomped her foot fiercely. How could she be this unlucky? She managed to bump into such an important figure while out for a simple cup of tea. No wonder they had suddenly been dumped into the middle of this once-in-a-blue-moon assassination attempt. As much as Chu Lian hated the situation, The more anxious she got, the clearer her mind became. She ordered the two maidservants to leave right now. She turned and left. In her peripheral vision, she noticed that the azure-eyed man simply glanced at her before continuing his fight with the men in black. Another 7 or 8 more assassins rushed out from the room, each of them highly skilled in martial arts. Chu Lian was absolutely frightened. She hadn't expected to bump into an assassination, let alone one with so many assassins. And there were only 3 guards around that azure-eyed man. Chu Lian shut her eyes tightly. Although she wanted to help him, she knew her own limits. If she were to try to help him, she would only be a burden. There was no way she would be able to assist him. Chu Lian ran even faster. Luckily, the assassins were fixed on their target. Although they noticed her running away, they didn't send anyone to chase after her. Thus, she was able to heave a great sigh of relief. Just as Chu Lian thought that the 3 of them were finally clear of danger, she heard heavy footsteps coming from the stairway to the 2nd floor of Defeng Tea House. When Chu Lian looked up, she met with Royal Princess Duanjia's eyes. Chapter 128. Sudden Change 3. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Royal Princess Duanjia clearly hadn't discovered the intense fighting going on just beyond the corridor. She smiled a little weakly and asked, "Chu Lu, why did you come out of the room?" Chu Lian knew that things were going to turn bad. She turned back in a panic. As expected, the assassins surrounding the azure-eyed man noticed Royal Princess Duanjia. One of them made a gesture towards 2 others, and those 2 men came chasing after with their swords raised. In that short moment, Royal Princess Duanjia had also discovered the strange events going on not far down the corridor. Her pupils shrunk and she shouted anxiously, "Fourth brother!" Immediately after her shout, the man trapped in the middle of the assassins got slashed on his arm. Royal Princess Duanjia's heart grew heavier with worry. She decisively ordered the 2 people following behind her to help. Chu Lian felt a headache coming on. She walked up to the princess within a few strides and tried to pull her along as she ran downstairs. Chu Lian tried to pull with all her might, but she realized that she couldn't even move the princess. Her expression turned serious and she snapped in a fit of anger, "Princess, you can't save 4th Prince even if you stay here. You'll just become a burden for him. If you don't leave now, there might really be no hope left for 4th Prince." Royal Princess Duanjia stared blankly at Chu Lian for all of 2 seconds before she recovered her senses thanks to Chu Lian's shout. Now back to her rational self, she was the one who took up the task of pulling on Chu Lian's arm while running away. Chu Lian froze for an instant before finally sighing in relief. The servants accompanying Royal Princess Duanjia had already gone to help Prince Jean, so the princess didn't have any servants left with her. Wenlan was the only one who knew martial arts, and the men in black were gaining on them from behind. Chu Lian and Princess Duanjia were only weak young ladies after all. After running for a while, their legs were already out of strength. When they reached the 1st floor and headed towards the back of the building, Chu Lian gazed at the unfamiliar surroundings. She abruptly made a decision in her heart. She tugged Royal Princess Duanjia to a corner, before instructing Wenlan and Xiyin. "Wenlan, you're faster on your feet. Go and get some help. Xiyin, find a place to hide. Don't come out, no matter what. Do you understand?" Third young madam's usual soft and gentle tone had morphed into one brimming with determination and unshakable resolution. Although her voice sounded the same, there was an unseen power that made others want to obey. Wenlan was about to reject her orders, but when Chu Lian's moist, determined eyes met her gaze, she couldn't bring herself to speak. Royal Princess Duanjia peeked at Chu Lu from the side, her own eyes filled with both amazement and a trust that she hadn't realized she held towards Chu Lian. Wenlan pressed her lips together in worry, but quickly turned and left. Without Chu Lian and the others holding her back, Wenlan's speed increased 2-fold. In a few seconds, she had already vanished from their sight. Chu Lian cast a single glance at Xiyin before completely ignoring her. She tugged Royal Princess Duanjia towards a narrow doorway. Chu Lian smiled bitterly inside. It would actually be pretty easy for her to stay alive. All she had to do was to abandon Royal Princess Duanjia. She could sense that the assassins were only targeting members of the imperial family. However, she couldn't do that. Setting aside her burgeoning friendship with Royal Princess Duanjia, even if she really abandoned the princess here, she would definitely be affected no matter the outcome of the events today. The rage of the current emperor and Prince Wei would not be easy to bear. Besides, she and the princess had already had the good fortune to meet. Whether or not that was through cosmic design, their compatible personalities still meant something. Abandoning the princess was not something she could ever do. Chu Lian was a little frustrated with herself, but she couldn't suppress her sense of righteousness. She could only get angry at herself. Her face also turned cold due to her inward tussle with her thoughts. The faster the two girls ran, the more tired they became. The sound of footsteps behind them had grown louder and louder, like a countdown to their deaths. Chu Lian's heart was beating fast. There were no other entrances in the little courtyard they were in, so they couldn't escape. She urgently scanned the area for something that could help. Her gaze paused at two particular areas of the courtyard. Chu Lian could feel her resolve strengthening. She pulled Royal Princess Duanjia to the side of the well in the courtyard, and with a grave voice said, "Princess, take off your outer coat." Royal Princess Duanjia's pupils abruptly shrunk as she looked right into Chu Lian's eyes. She seemed to understand immediately what Chu Lian was trying to do. "Chu Lu, you can't." How could Chu Lian possibly allow the princess to object now? She was already undoing the ties of the princess's coat. "Princess, trust me. Hurry up, we don't have any more time left. It'll all be over if they catch up to us." Tears gathered in Royal Princess Duanjia's eyes. She bit down hard on her lower lip before she stripped off her outer coat without any more hesitation. Chu Lian threw her own outer layer of clothing to the princess before quickly putting on the outer coat that Princess Duanjia had taken off. Upon hearing the sounds of their pursuers talking, she tensed, and without waiting for Royal Princess Duanjia to put on her coat properly, Chu Lian pushed the princess into the well. There was the sound of a huge splash. The princess stifled her cry of surprise by covering her mouth tightly. The water surrounding her was slightly cold. Before she could react, Chu Lian threw something into the well, and the princess hurriedly dodged. Chu Lian stood by the well, fretting as she looked down into the dark confines. Royal Princess Duanjia could hear her soft voice calling out a reminder. "Princess, hold on to that piece of wood. Hide in the water." In the next second, the mouth of the well was covered, plunging the world within into an unnatural silence. Royal Princess Duanjia did as Chu Lian had said, hugging tightly onto the round piece of wood as she floated near the surface of the water. Her eyes were already damp from the water in the well, but it felt like something hot was about to gush out of them. She smacked the surface of the water hard, raging in her heart. "Chu Lu, if you didn't throw this piece of wood in after, I would have thought you were trying to murder this princess. You idiot. Do you even know how to save someone? Aren't you lucky that this princess is so brave and knows how to swim? If I were one of those delicate little noble ladies who couldn't even lift a handkerchief, wouldn't I have been frightened to death by you before ever getting close to being assassinated?" Chapter 129. Saved 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Royal Princess Duanjia rubbed the corners of her eyes as she inwardly continued her outburst. "Chu Lu, you dummy. You'd better be alive after this. You still owe this princess a whole roast duck. You promised that we'll make it together next time. You can't go back on your promises. Otherwise, this princess will make trouble for the entire House Jing'an, especially that darn annoying husband of yours." Royal Princess Duanjia suddenly had something out for He Changdi. After all that happened, Chu Lian had already become her best friend. Furthermore, Chu Lian was such a nice person, but that He Sanlang actually dared to abandon her. He was definitely a wife-abandoning animal. Chu Lian, still standing in the small courtyard, didn't have the spare time to think of all that. Her heart was thumping rapidly in her chest. It was impossible not to be scared. However, she didn't have a choice. Chu Lian quickly put on Royal Princess Duanjia's coat and ran over to the pile of kindling near the entrance of the closed courtyard. She dove inside in a panic. Under the cover of some dried grass, Chu Lien didn't dare to move an inch. She held the mental map of the courtyard in her mind and calculated the escape route she was going to take. She pressed on her own chest with her right hand and felt the beating of heart. In her heart, she prayed for Wanlon to return quickly with reinforcements. From the gaps in the grass covering her, Chu Lien could see the two pursuers carefully stepping into the courtyard. They were completely covered in black clothing. Even their faces were wrapped up in black, leaving only their sinister-looking eyes peeking out. The swords they held had been covered in blood at some point. Beads of red were rolling down the sharp blades and dripping onto the tile-covered ground. Chu Lien felt like she could almost hear the pitter-patter of the falling blood. Her heart in her throat, she watched every movement that the assassins made. The two men swept the courtyard with their gazes once they entered, as if they were just about to find either her or Royal Princess Duanjia. Chu Lien shut her eyes and took a deep breath. The next time her eyes opened, they were as bright as stars in the night sky. She mentally counted to 3 before pushing aside the kindling covering her. Without any room for further thought, Chu Lien ran towards the entrance of the courtyard. When the two assassins spotted the young girl appearing out of nowhere, one of them quickly followed after her while the other remained in the courtyard. The remaining assassin walked up to the kindling pile that Chu Lien had just been hiding in and used his sword to poke through it. After pushing aside the grass and discovering that there was no one else hiding in there, he spat in anger. After that, he continued looking through the courtyard. It seemed like the assassins weren't stupid. Eventually, the gaze of the remaining assassin landed on the only well in the courtyard. He strode towards the well and lifted the wooden cover on top of it, scanning the inside. Although it was rather deep, the sunlight reached far enough that he could see the bottom. Seeing that there was only a piece of wood floating on the water's surface and nothing else, he harumphed and turned to leave. Hiding under that piece of wood was Royal Princess Duanjia. She waited until a few more moments had passed before she dared to come up for air. In her heart, she cursed the assassins 1,000,000 times over, while worrying for Chu Lien's safety. As her lungs cried out for more air, Chu Lien's steps grew heavier and heavier. The footsteps behind her sounded closer and closer, and it seemed like there wasn't a shred of hope left for her. Under the wide sleeves of her clothes, Chu Lien gripped a golden hairpin she had removed from her head. If there was really no other choice, then she would choose death. She took a deep breath. Death didn't seem so scary in the midst of all this tension. She wondered if she would return to her original world if she died. If she could, the first thing she would do was write a 500-long review to scold the author of this book. The face of her pursuer seemed to carry a wretched smile behind the dark cloth wrapping around his face. His sword was just about to reach her. Chu Lien could almost feel the air being pushed towards her by the blade. All her energy was gone. She was struggling to breathe. She purposely stumbled on her next step, miraculously dodging the assassin's fierce strike. Sprawled on the ground without any more strength to dodge the next attack, Chu Lien turned and stared at the assassin. She pressed her lips together tightly, determination clear on her face. When the assassin finally saw the face of his target, a flash of annoyance passed through his eyes. He had been chasing the wrong person. He angrily shouted, "You damned bitch! You tried to trick me. Since you're not the princess, there's no use in keeping you." Right as he finished speaking, his sharp blade began its descent, its target Chu Lien's snow-white nape. The silhouette of the blade was reflected in Chu Lien's eyes. Her gaze sharpened. She refused to give up. Even at this critical moment, she didn't want to give up. No matter where she was, nothing was more important than her very own life. The spark in her eyes brightened as strength gathered in her body from who knew where. She flipped over and actually dodged the man's attack. At the same time, she rolled next to his feet. She tightly gripped the hairpin in her hands and, without any hesitation at all, plunged it into his foot. The man cried out in pain as his eyes flushed red. Even in his wildest dreams, he would never have thought that this fragile little noble girl could hurt him. He punted Chu Lien away and increased the ferocity of his attacks. That burst of movement has expended the last drop of energy in Chu Lien's body. She didn't have any power left in her to fight. The blood-stained blade flashed. It was going to fall upon her any second now. Chu Lian quickly shut her eyes. Chapter 130. Saved 2. This chapter has been stolen from Rendezvous novels. Please read from the original source. However, the pain she had expected never came. Instead, she heard a whoosh. Chu Lian panted as she laid sprawled on the ground. When she slowly opened her eyes, she saw that the assassin had already fallen next to her, his eyes wide with an arrow through his throat. Chu Lian pushed herself up with difficulty before she looked around. She immediately spotted the azure-eyed man on the second floor, sporting a bow in his hands. That arrow was his. Chu Lian let out a sigh of relief as her body softened into mush. Without waiting for Chu Lian to catch her breath, that whoosh sounded again. She turned to look, a little stiffened, and saw that the second pursuer had also been shot to death with a single arrow. By then, Chu Lian had finally regained her senses and realized that someone had just died right in front of her. Her pupils shrank and her face turned extremely pale. Still leaning on her arms, she began to shuffle backwards, as if trying to get away from the dead men. Not much later, a number of troops charged down from Defing Tea House. The azure-eyed man led them straight to Chu Lian. She saw that the soldiers were wearing armor and carrying swords at their waists. These must have been the reinforcements from the city guards that Wanlan had sent for. The azure-eyed man extended a hand to help Chu Lian up. "Six, Miss Chu, are you hurt anywhere?" Chu Lian felt like jelly all over, but she persisted in standing up. She took a small glance up at him before quickly lowering her gaze. Chu Lian pressed her lips together and shook her head. "Your Highness Prince Jean, I'm fine. I just suffered a shock, but I'm uninjured." Once he heard Chu Lian addressing him as Prince Jean, his extraordinary azure eyes narrowed slightly. Prince Jean waved two people forward, and two maidservants immediately came forth from behind him. They gently supported Chu Lian at either side. By this time, Wanlan had also come charging out of the crowd. Seeing that Chu Lian was safe, tears spilled out from her eyes. "Third young madam, it's good that you're all right." Chu Lian tried her best to pull out a weak smile for Wanlan. Without waiting for her to speak, Wanlan knew what she wanted to ask. "Third young madam, please don't worry. Xian is fine. She had a small injury, but the doctors are tending to her in the forecourt of the tea house." Without waiting for the two to finish their conversation, another person rushed forward from the crowd. Chu Lian turned to look and realized that it was Royal Princess Duanjia's handmaid, Jinxiu. The moment Jinxiu came over, she grabbed onto Chu Lian's thigh. She cried out in anxiety, "Third young madam, what about our princess? Where has our princess gone?" Prince Jean glanced at the outer coat that Chu Lian was wearing. When he recognized it as Royal Princess Duanjia's, a trace of understanding flashed through his mind. Chu Lian blushed, the red evident against her pale face. After narrowly escaping danger, she had actually completely forgotten about the princess in the well. She awkwardly coughed to hide her guilt and secretly glanced at Prince Jean. "Come with me." Wanlan quickly moved up to support Chu Lian. When Chu Lian led Prince Jean and the soldiers to that little courtyard, she peeked into the well and saw that there was no one there. Noticing that the piece of wood was still floating on the surface, she shouted loudly, "Princess, come out quickly. Help has come." The tough soldiers surrounding them had constipated expressions on their faces. Following that, ripples appeared on the surface of the water as a head suddenly popped up from under the wood, like a water ghost. Royal Princess Duanjia's voice resounded with anger. "Chu Lu, you're late. Hurry and get someone to pull this princess up." Hearing the anger in Royal Princess Duanjia's voice, Chu Lian was finally able to relax. Actually, as Chu Lian reflected on her actions, she admitted it was a little too rough of her to have pushed the princess down the well. She had only been thinking of saving her life, but she hadn't thought of the mental anguish that the saved princess would have been going through. Luckily, Royal Princess Duanjia wasn't such a fragile person. The soldiers quickly prepared some rope and threw it into the well. Once they brought up the soaking wet princess, without waiting for Prince Jean to put the cloak he had prepared around the princess, Royal Princess Duanjia reached out and hugged the dazed Chu Lian tightly. The princess' voice sounded a little hoarse as she whispered into Chu Lian's ear, "Stupid Chu Lu. Do you know how scared I was alone in that well? If I have nightmares after this, I'm going to buy a puppet, paste your name on it, and stick a needle into it every day to relieve my trauma." Chu Lian froze up after hearing the princess's words. As expected, this princess was really hateful. All she had were complaints after she had saved her life. Chu Lian was at a loss for what to do when she suddenly realized that there was something hot flowing down her neck. Chu Lian's heart immediately softened. She patted Royal Princess Duanjia's back lightly and reassured her with a gentle tone. "I'm sorry, it's my fault. If Princess has nightmares in the future, I'll make something delicious for you to eat. Okay?" Royal Princess Duanjia was choked with sobs as she pushed Chu Lian away and wiped her tears. She stared at Chu Lian with reddened eyes before pursing her lips. "Chu Lu, are you serious? Don't you dare lie to me. I want to eat that cat head cookie and your handmade roast duck." "Chu Lian, my dear princess, could you stop changing moods so quickly? My delicate heart can't take it. Are you sure you weren't crying so pitifully just to trick some food out of me?" Chu Lian wanted to roll her eyes at the princess. Chapter 131. Twins 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Prince Jean had been watching off to the side the entire time. The corner of his lips twitched. After bearing with it for a long moment, he gave in and spoke up. "This prince will send some men to escort you back to Prince Wei's estate." It was only then that Royal Princess Duanjia turned around and noticed Prince Jean there. She wiped away the tears in her eyes before asking, "Fourth brother, are you all right?" "Just some minor wounds. They'll heal soon. This prince has to continue investigating with the city guards, so Longcheng will escort you back with some men." Fourth imperial brother, please be careful." The maidservants waiting at the side brought over a cloak and covered Royal Princess Duanjia with it. With Chu Lian supporting her, the two of them boarded a carriage driven by one of Prince Jin's bodyguards. The carriage went all the way into the main entrance of Prince Wei's estate, and even past the screen at the entrance. There, it stopped. Chu Lian alighted before Royal Princess Duanjia, so she was the first to notice the middle-aged woman anxiously waiting next to the carriage with a group of maidservants and senior servants. The moment Royal Princess Duanjia got off the carriage, she charged right into the arms of the noble lady. "Mother, my good child, you've scared Mother to death today." The group of servants flew into a flurry of activity when the princess alighted from the carriage. Some of them brought clothes, while others brought over warm braziers. In this panic, Chu Lian didn't forget her manners. Although she couldn't move forward, she made a perfect bow to Princess Wei. Although Princess Wei was concerned with her daughter's condition, she still kept an eye on Chu Lian from the corner of her eye. Noting that Chu Lian hadn't shown a single shred of panic or fear, she inwardly gave a nod of approval. After a moment, when Royal Princess Duanjia was warmed up again, she remembered that Chu Lian was still waiting at the side. She quickly pushed aside the servants surrounding her and tugged Chu Lian closer. "Mother, the only reason I'm still standing before you today is all thanks to Chu Lu." Princess Wei raised an elegant eyebrow. "Oh." One of Princess Wei's most trusted servants saw that Royal Princess Duanjia was about to continue speaking, so she hurriedly spoke up and suggested, "Royal Princess and House Jing'an's third young madam have just narrowly escaped calamity. Why not drive away the bad luck first by stepping over these braziers? If there are things to say, surely it can wait until later in Princess Wei's room, after a nice warm bath?" Princess Wei nodded and called someone to bring a small brazier in front of the two young ladies. Royal Princess Duanjia insisted on holding Chu Lian's hand as they stepped over the braziers together, so Chu Lian had no other choice but to follow. After that, the two of them were sent to the bath in Princess Wei's courtyard. Princess Wei sent a handmaid over to serve Chu Lian. The handmaid thought ahead and prepared a set of clothing for her to change into after her bath. When the two young ladies had changed into a fresh set of clothes, they came out from behind the changing screens supported by some maidservants. They took one look at each other and burst out into laughter. The servants wiped their hair dry as they sat together in front of the dressing table. Royal Princess Duanjia turned to look at Chu Lian, then at herself, before pointing at a set of accessories on the table. This, and this." Put them on this princess and Chu Lu. Chu Lian glanced at the accessories and quickly tried to put a stop to it. Princess, I can't do that. That's a phoenix tail hairpin. Royal Princess Duanjia wasn't happy. Why can't you wear that? It's not like it's a special five-tailed phoenix hairpin. Even a titled noble wife can wear one. The corner of Chu Lian's lips twitched. She didn't even have a noble title, so how could she wear that hairpin? Royal Princess Duanjia harumphed. That he Sanlang is really useless. What good is he other than being a little handsome? He's like an embroidered pillow. He couldn't even get a noble title for his wife. How were you so blind as to choose him? Don't worry, Chu Lu. Just put this hairpin on first. This princess will get you a noble title later on. This sounded really strange, regardless of the context. For one, the people here believed in having their parents choose their marriage partners, so she hardly had a choice in who to marry. If she had known earlier that he Sanlang had such a crazy personality, she wouldn't have wanted to marry him. Chu Lian was helpless. She couldn't win over Royal Princess Duanjia, since the princess had a much higher status. Not to mention, she was the guest here. In the end, Chu Lian couldn't say anything. Chapter 132. Twins 2. Princess Wei was still waiting in the parlor outside. When the two young ladies were done dressing up, they walked into the parlor holding hands. Princess Wei was stunned for a moment. In her eyes, two young ladies, around the age of 14 or 15 and about the same height, had just entered the room. The girl on the left was wearing a light pink dress made out of soft silk with wide sleeves and a translucent overcoat. The girl on the right was dressed in the same style, but with a different color, light purple. The two of them had similar figures and had adorned themselves with the same hairstyle. Even the hairpins and accessories on their heads were exactly the same. Only their expressions and features were different. However, they were both tender young ladies in the bloom of their youth. No one could shift their gazes away. In an instant, everyone in the room was dazed from the sight. Royal Princess Duanjia tugged Chu Lian forward with her a few steps. She tilted her head to one side and asked, "Mother, what do you think? Do we look pretty?" It was only then that Princess Wei came to her senses. Her gaze still seemed misty, and she hurriedly tried to hide the trace of pain in the depths of her eyes. One of her senior servants noticed that something wasn't right and quickly poured a cup of tea for Princess Wei to help her hide her sorrow. The senior servant then smiled happily and replied, "Royal Princess and third young madam, you both look beautiful dressed like this. This old servant is almost blinded by how pretty you look." Senior servant Lon usually has high standards. Since she thinks that we're pretty, then we definitely must be. Chu Lu, see, this princess made a good choice, right? Chu Lian's heart was almost in her throat. How was this good in any way? Royal Princess Duanjia was way too oblivious. If she were to dress in the same clothes as her host in any other estate, it would be considered very disrespectful towards her hosts. In this case, that would be the two princesses before her. Luckily, it seemed like Princess Wei hadn't taken it badly, so Chu Lian heaved an inner sigh of relief. Senior servant Lon didn't have the time to care about what the two young ladies were thinking. She glanced at Princess Wei's expression from time to time. Her hands had also traveled to Princess Wei's back at some point and were patting the princess back gently, as if comforting her. Senior servant Lon sighed in her heart. Who would have expected Royal Princess Duanjia's careless gesture to have pierced right into Princess Wei's most painful spot? No one knew of this other than Prince Wei and the old servants who had served at Princess Wei's side back then, not even the two young princes. At the birth of Royal Princess Duanjia, Princess Wei had given birth to twins. Both of the twins were daughters, but only one survived. They weren't able to save the other. To prevent others from using this event to claim that Prince Wei's estate was unlucky, Prince Wei made the decision to cover it all up. Even now, Royal Princess Duanjia didn't have the slightest idea that she had a twin sister who had passed away. Other than their looks, Chu Lian was similar to Royal Princess Duanjia in age and figure. Now that she was dressed in the same set of clothes as Royal Princess Duanjia and standing in front of Princess Wei, didn't they seem like a lovely pair of sisters? To Princess Wei, it was like she was looking upon the daughter who had passed away so early in life. How could her heart have possibly remained unmoved? Chapter 133. Twins 3. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Princess Wei took in a deep breath. By the time she set down her teacup and raised her head, she had already calmed the turbulent emotions in her heart. She cast a careful, measuring gaze over the two young girls in front of her, before reaching out to pull them closer. She stroked Royal Princess Duanjia's forehead and patted Chu Lian's little hand gently. When she caught sight of the phoenix tail hairpin in Chu Lian's hair, her eyes narrowed and she sent an admonishing glare to Royal Princess Duanjia. Good. This princess ordered these 2 bolts of fabric a few days ago. It looks like the dresses turned out well. Look at these 2 girls. They look like sisters dressed in the same outfit. Royal Princess Duanjia's reply was a bright smile, like her mother's reaction was only to be expected. On the other hand, Chu Lian was shocked. But she managed to hide it well, not forgetting to issue a standard polite reply as she said, "It's Royal Princess Duanjia who has good taste. All right, the 2 of you must have suffered much shock today. This princess has arranged for some guards to send Chu Lu home. On another day, this princess will personally send an invite for Chu Lu to come and spend time with this princess and Royal Princess Duanjia." She hadn't realized that time had passed so quickly that it was already evening. Royal Princess Duanjia knew that it wasn't appropriate to keep Chu Lian any longer, so she could only agree to sending Chu Lian home with the estate's guards. Royal Princess Duanjia even escorted her all the way to the entrance. Even when Chu Lian was boarding the carriage, she still seemed reluctant to let her go. "Chu Lu, don't forget. You promised to cook roast duck with me." Chu Lian patted Royal Princess Duanjia's hand in comfort. "Princess, you should return quickly. Don't let Princess Wei worry. I won't forget about our promise. I'll even bring cat head-shaped cookies with me the next time I come, too." It was only after Chu Lian's carriage had departed that Royal Princess Duanjia returned to her estate, accompanied by her maidservants. One of Royal Princess Duanjia's handmaids, Jin Xiao, had already explained the whole course of events today to Princess Wei. Senior servant Lan shared her thoughts. "It really was all thanks to House Jing'an's 3rd young madam that our young princess made it back safely today. No wonder the young princess is unusually close to her and treats her like a sister. Even to the point of reliance," went unsaid. Princess Wei's gaze was a little darkened. She suddenly stood up and entered her bedroom deeper within the building. When she pressed a certain spot behind a table, a small door appeared on one of the walls of the bedroom with some calligraphy hanging on it. Princess Wei passed through the door and walked right up to the incense table filled with offerings. She took up the small memorial tablet on the table and wiped it gently with her handkerchief. When she heard the soft footsteps behind her, Princess Wei could no longer hold back her tears. She asked, "Momo, do you think it's little Enrich who has come back? Back then, that lady doctor told me little Enrich passed on the moment she was born because she wanted to protect her little sister. She gave all the nutrients she had in her mother's womb to her little sister, so she couldn't survive. Now Duanjia has been saved by her again." Senior servant Lan's heart ached for Princess Wei, but she noticed that the princess looked a little off. Princess Wei's body had been injured during the birth of the twins, and she could never have any more children. The firstborn young princess hadn't taken her first breath after leaving her mother's womb. Thus, Royal Princess Duanjia became even more precious to Princess Wei, and she showered her with all the affection meant for 2 children. That lost little princess became a sore spot in Princess Wei's heart. Although she had never mentioned it before, she had prepared this altar for the lost princess. However, it was clear that Princess Wei's heart had never recovered from the loss, and it seemed like her mental state was deteriorating. Senior servant Lan had also taken a good look at House Jing'an's 3rd young madam today. If that 3rd young madam had been someone with impure motives, she would have definitely persuaded Princess Wei out of her dangerous mindset. However, 6th Miss Chu had saved Royal Princess Duanjia without caring for her own life. Senior servant Lan sighed with emotion and went along with Princess Wei's belief. Perhaps that 6th Miss Chu really does share some fate with her. Although she's already married, she's the same age as our young princess. Even her figure and looks are somewhat similar. If they had gone out in those dresses today, perhaps they might have been mistaken for sisters. Since she saved the young princess, it's perfectly normal for Princess to treat her well. Princess Wei seemed to be reassured by Senior Servant Lan's words. She caressed the small tablet in her hands and placed it back onto the altar, her eyes a little misty. Momo, you're right. That child deserves better. Furthermore, she saved my Duanjia today. Senior Servant Lan saw that Princess Wei had recovered her usual calm, so she finally relaxed. Meanwhile, Chu Lian had gone through a roller coaster of emotions today. It wasn't until she boarded the carriage that she could truly relax. As Wanlan fanned her from the side, Chu Lian leaned against the carriage window and shut her eyes to rest. After a short moment, she asked, "Where are the clothes and accessories I changed out of?" Chapter 134, Lucky Jade Amulet, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Xian quickly brought out a wooden case from one side. Third young madam, the accessories you were wearing this morning are all here. As for your clothes, the princess's senior servant said that they were stained with bad luck, so they were burned together with the royal princess clothes in the braziers. Chu Lian nodded and took the wooden case from Xian's hands. Xian had only been injured on her elbows and legs. The rest of her body was completely fine. She opened the case and rummaged through its contents. Chu Lian's expression instantly darkened. She searched once again. All the accessories she had been wearing were still there, except for that lucky jade amulet. Xian, when you were putting my things away, did you see that jade amulet I was carrying at my waist this morning? Xian was also extremely tired and tense. When she heard Chu Lian's words, her face immediately turned pale. She looked into the wooden case and recalled that third young madam had indeed been wearing a jade amulet this morning. However, now it wasn't in the case. Third young madam, when this servant was putting away the accessories, this servant didn't see the jade amulet at all. What? Chu Lian collapsed against the side of the carriage, the events from the original story continuously flashing through her mind. That lucky jade amulet had been gifted by Matriarch He during the tea ceremony. Later on, Chu Lian had given it to Xiao Bojian during one of their clandestine meetings as a token of their love. Xiao Bojian had worn the amulet at his waist every day after that. Of course, He Changdi coincidentally caught sight of it and quarreled with Chu Lian when he got home. However, Chu Lian had completely ignored He Changdi's anger. She had also been brazen to the point of meeting Xiao Bojian in front of He Changdi's very nose. Chu Lian felt a headache coming on. Xiao Bojian couldn't possibly have picked up the jade amulet that she lost by accident, right? If that really happened, she wouldn't be able to wash her sins away even if she jumped into the Yellow River. However, thinking back to the events at Defeng Tea House and recalling the distance she had run to avoid the assassins, she had most likely dropped it somewhere along that path. If the city guards picked it up, there might even be a possibility that they would return it to her. That thought helped Chu Lian calm down a little. Her mind was a mess right now. However, Xian suddenly knelt in front of her with a thump. Third young madam, it's all this servant's fault. This servant failed to take care of your possessions. Please punish this servant. Chu Lian's eyes opened wide in shock. She then sighed and helped Xian up. This has nothing to do with you. I was the one who carelessly lost my amulet. You couldn't possibly have kept an eye on my accessories the entire time. Forget it. It's just a single jade amulet. I'll ask Royal Princess Duanjia if she has seen it the next time we meet. Perhaps it'll turn up somehow. Xian secretly checked Chu Lian's expression and found that she really wasn't angry. Her heart was full of guilt, but at the same time, she felt that third young madam's temper had gotten much better. If this had happened when they were back in House Ingwa and third young madam had lost something, it would have been their fault for not taking care of her things, and they would have been punished severely. Now that she thought about it, back then, third young madam had been obsessed with riches. However, now she seemed not to care about these material possessions as much. Perhaps third young madam had become more forgiving after marriage? As she thought along these lines, Xian started to sympathize with third young madam. Chu Lian didn't have the time to care about the direction of Xian's thoughts. She was near speechless at how she had been able to bump into Xiao Bojian despite all her effort in dodging him. She had a strange feeling that there was some hidden hand guiding all these events along. Chu Lian pouted in a fit of temper. She was going to be more careful the next time. She refused to believe that she wouldn't be able to dodge that Xiaobojian. She didn't want to be involved with that damned Xiaobojian one bit. Her carefree days were much more important. Anyone who dared to disrupt her lazy days would be making an enemy out of her. Chapter 135. Lucky Jade Amulet 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. The carriage slowly made its way through the streets. Just as they were about to reach the Jing'an estate, Chu Lian instructed Wan Lan to rearrange her hair. Then, she would change back into the accessories she had been wearing when she left this morning. Her hair had been arranged in a maiden girl's hairstyle back at Prince Wei's estate, so she definitely had to change out of it before she returned to her husband's home. The phoenix tail hairpin that Royal Princess Duanjia had made her wear also had to be removed, otherwise it would be another cause for wagging tongues. However, she couldn't change out of the dress that Royal Princess Duanjia had given to her. The news that Chu Lian had returned to the Jing'an estate quickly made its way to Matriarch He and Madame Zhou's ears. Chu Lian knew that she couldn't possibly hide the day's events, so she didn't return to Songtao Court upon reaching the Jing'an estate. Instead, she took Wan Lan and Shi Yin with her to Qingxi Hall. The waiting Madame Zhou also brought her servants with her as she headed to Qingxi Hall. The two of them met in the corridor outside. Chu Lian had already sensed the discontent that Madame Zhou seemed to hold for her, so she made doubly sure that her every gesture and action was courteous and in line. "My greetings to eldest sister-in-law." Chu Lian bobbed in salute to Madame Zhou. Madame Zhou moved forward a few steps to help her up. However, her gaze was looking Chu Lian up and down. When she recognized the fabric that Chu Lian was wearing, something shook in the depths of her eyes. Despite that, on the surface, she was full of smiles. "Sister-in-law, you seem to be wearing a different dress than the one you were wearing this morning. Soft silk. An imperial tribute. Even the imperial family didn't get much of this fabric. It was an imperial tribute from the small country of Sinan. Only titled noble wives were allowed to wear them. Consort Da had gotten 2 bolts of this fabric last year, and had given half a bolt to Heir Dingyuan's wife, Madame Huang. Madame Huang had used all of it to make a dress. When she wore it to the orchid appreciation party amongst the titled noble wives, she had looked outstanding and garnered much admiration. However, Chu Lian was now wearing a dress made of that very same fabric. Another headache started building in Chu Lian's head. She knew this was going to happen. She gathered up every shred of her patience to explain everything to Madame Zhou. "Eldest sister-in-law, something happened at Prince Wei's estate today. Let's enter Qingxi Hall first. I'll explain everything to you and grandmother together. This dress I'm wearing belongs to Royal Princess Duanjia, and she's simply lending it to me temporarily." Madame Zhou was shocked. Royal Princess Duanjia's dress. When had Chu Lian gotten so close to the princess? How could Royal Princess Duanjia have given her such an expensive dress just like that? Judging by how new and pristine it looked, it seemed like the princess had never even worn it after it had been made. Madame Zhou suppressed the shock in her heart and followed Chu Lian into Qingxi Hall. It was only after explaining everything to Matriarch He and Madame Zhou that Chu Lian could drag her exhausted body over to Songtao Court to rest, escorted by senior servant Liu. When Madame Zhou returned to her own courtyard, her mind was reeling. She hadn't expected such a windfall to have fallen into Chu Lian's lap after a simple trip outside. Not only had she built a connection to Prince Wei's estate, but even the normally unapproachable Prince Jean was now in her debt. With things as they stood, Chu Lian would definitely be making another visit to Prince Wei's estate. Madame Zhou had already started making plans in her mind. After senior servant Liu returned from sending Chu Lian back to Songtao Court, she saw that Matriarch He was still sitting in the parlor. The candles around her flickered, casting her face in alternating light and shadow. She seemed to be deep in thought. Senior servant Liu walked up to the matriarch's side and gently massaged her shoulders. "Matriarch, are you thinking about what happened to third young madam today?" The matriarch heaved a long sigh. This old woman could have never expected that girl to bring about such change. Perhaps it's due to third young madam's courage, intelligence, kindness, and how much she values friendship. Otherwise, she wouldn't have thought up a plan to save Royal Princess Duanjia under those circumstances. If this old servant is permitted to say more, Then His Highness Prince Jean was also saved thanks to third young madam today. If not for third young madam sending one lawn to get the city guards, how could they have caught the assassins so quickly? TL note. I met up with Et Volare and some other Volare staff in Singapore last weekend, and there are pics over here for our Volare celebration. http://Volare novels. com/happy Volare Volare turns 2/. Chapter 136, Lover's Token 1. Of course I know all that. I just didn't expect that the wife I happened to pick out for Sanlang would turn out to be such a lucky star. Isn't it so? If third young madam continues her friendship with Prince Wei's estate, it'll be tremendously beneficial for our estate. Prince Wei was extremely close to the current emperor, yet he wasn't involved in politics. His house was also known for being morally upright. Having connections with Prince Wei's estate would only bring them benefits and no harm at all. Matriarch, this old servant isn't sure whether to speak freely. Matriarch, he glared at senior servant Lu. You silly servant. There's nothing that you can't say freely in front of me. Senior servant Lu paused her massage and moved over to face the matriarch. Matriarch, this old servant wonders if you noticed eldest young madam's expression today. This old servant is afraid that eldest young madam's thoughts may be straying towards the wrong path. Matriarch, he sunk into silence. Dalong's wife. When Chu Lian returned to Songtao Court, she had a quick meal with some snacks before returning to her bedroom. It had been a physically and mentally taxing day for her, so she intended to go to bed early and get a good night's sleep. Regardless of the troubles currently plaguing her mind, Chu Lian determined that leaving the pondering to tomorrow was a better course of action than keeping herself up the entire night today. Fuyin pushed aside the gauze curtains on the bedchamber. First, she glanced at Shiyin, who was standing ramrod straight as she guarded the chamber. Next, she peeped at Chu Lian, lying on the bed. Although nothing showed on her expression, her curiosity was burning. She hated that she couldn't immediately question Shiyin about what had happened today. She wanted to know if third young madam had met Mr. Xiao today while out of the estate. Was she secretly having an affair with Mr. Xiao? That high-quality dress that third young madam had changed into was also suspicious. She couldn't possibly have changed into it after meeting Mr. Xiao, right? All sorts of scenarios played out in Fuyin's mind. When she thought of third young master's cool and handsome face, she pinched her palm for courage. Third young master was so good-looking. If third young madam had betrayed third young master, she wouldn't let it continue. Though Fuyin was so hung up over He Changda's looks now, if she could see what He Sanlang looked like as he roughed it out at the northern border, she probably wouldn't be using the word handsome to describe him anytime soon. Xiao Bojian had already escaped to Fin Tea House long before the city guard's arrival, but that didn't mean he wasn't close by. Standing inside a fabric store opposite the tea house, Xiao Bojian repeatedly clenched his hands into fists at his side. His eyes were murky, as if he were struggling inside. Finally, he turned and spoke to one in a low voice. Why don't you go to Defing Tea House and see how Lianer is doing? The expression on the bodyguard's average-looking, forgettable face seemed to flicker for a bit. However, in the end, he didn't disregard his master's request. He grunted in acknowledgement and merged back into the crowd on the street. After an hour, one was back. Xiao Bojian had already moved to a room on the second floor of the fabric store. He sat behind a desk, a calm expression on his face. However, his voice betrayed the anxiety he felt inside as he asked, "How was it?" One cupped his fists, reporting to Master. "Sixth Miss Chu is already safe. Master can relax now. The city guards have already taken down all the assassins." Xiao Bojian caught the thread of hesitation on one's face as he spoke. His expression darkened. "What are you trying to hide? Speak." Chapter 137, Lover's Token 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volare novels. Please read from the original source. One was most afraid of the darkly sinister look that sometimes graced his master's face, and it was this exact expression that he was wearing right now. One's body trembled a little as he pulled out an exquisite piece of jade from his sleeve. He respectfully offered it up to his master with both hands. Master, this subordinate found this in 6th Miss Chu's private room. Xiao Bojian reached out and took the jade amulet in hand. His slender fingers caressed the surface of the amulet. He recalled that this was the amulet that Chu Lian had been wearing today. It was a quality piece of jade, and the carving was finely detailed. He could tell that it was of great value at one glance. The carving on this jade amulet was beyond compare. It was also perfectly sized, so it could be worn by either gender. The embroidered string that it hung on was a bright pink, perhaps since Chu Lian had been wearing it. If it were changed to a dark blue or green string, it should be fine for a man. Xiao Bojian didn't think that Chu Lian would carelessly leave behind such a valuable piece of jade in the room. There was only one possibility, that she had done it on purpose. As for who this jade amulet had been meant for, he was the only man who had visited that room today, so the conclusion was clear. With a burst of emotion, Xiao Bojian clenched the amulet in his hands, a glint flashing through his eyes. When he heard one's report, the longing he felt in his heart grew even stronger. He never knew that his Lianer could be so smart and calm. Even if it had been him in that situation, he might not necessarily have been able to make the same bold and brave decision that Chu Lian had. Saving the 4th prince and building ties with Prince Wei's estate, his Lianer was truly one of a kind. The light in Xiao Bojian's eyes shone even brighter. Every time he discovered another one of her merits, it was even harder for him to let go of her. Even though she was already married to someone else, his covetous heart had never loosened its claws on her. Not once. He was the only one fit for his Lianer. He had been planning on approaching Chu Lian slowly, creating more chances for the two of them to meet. However, that he Sanlang had wisely backed out and left for the northern border all by himself. Then he didn't need to act recklessly. He had all the time in the world to come up with a plan, to make his beloved woman walk step by step into his carefully prepared trap and finally become his. Though he was still in the midst of building up his base of power, there wasn't any need to fear a small house like House Jing'an. Although the Jing'an estate was full of military officials, the current emperor heavily favored the literary officials. The only exceptions to this were the dragon and tiger guards. Other than the border generals, there were hardly any military officials with some sort of influence in the court now. Once this year's autumn examinations began, it would be his time to shine and display his ambition. One was watching the changes in his master's eyes as he held onto the jade amulet. He coughed twice and carefully asked, "Master." When this subordinate investigated the assassins for a moment, this subordinate noticed that there were black imprints on their left forearms. Black imprints? Xiao Bojian's eyes narrowed slightly. When one noticed that Xiao Bojian wasn't speaking, he continued his report. As far as this subordinate knows, black imprints were a secret imperial technique from the previous dynasty. There are venomous worms in the imprints. When these assassins fail their mission, the person controlling the main worm can activate those black imprints to force the assassins to commit suicide. Xiao Bojian waved his hand and didn't say anything else, simply acknowledging the report. Upon noticing his master's expression, one didn't continue speaking. However, he did continue that line of thought in the safety of his own mind. Were the mysterious assassins sent to kill the 4th prince and royal princess Duanjia by someone supporting the previous dynasty? They had changed to the Great Wu dynasty for many years now. Even if there was a remaining trace of the old imperial bloodline, they should have slowly faded into nothing by now. How could they have had the power to send assassins after a prince and princess in broad daylight, never mind on one of the main streets of the capital? The mystery of the assassins would require further investigation to resolve. Chapter 138, Lover's Token, 3. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. The morning after saw Chu Lian rising much earlier than usual, as she had gone to bed early last night. She had already decided what to make for breakfast the night before. It was going to be refreshing vegetarian wraps, paired with a light and salty vegetable porridge. After breakfast, Chu Lian noticed it was still early and went back to her little study to practice her calligraphy. She had some talent in calligraphy already, and she had experience in writing simplified Chinese words with pens. Now all she had to do was learn to use a brush and write in traditional Chinese words instead. She wasn't used to it at first, But after practicing for a few days, she had no problems writing most of the commonly used words. However, it was impossible for her to write exactly like Chu Lian had. Firstly, she wasn't good at copying. Secondly, there weren't many examples from the former host of this body that she could reference. Besides, she was herself, and she wasn't going to try to imitate the original Chu Lian. They were two completely different people in the first place. Although using a brush and writing in traditional Chinese words were easy enough, she still had a long way to go before her calligraphy could be anywhere close to passable. Chu Lian was more used to using pens instead of brushes. She got Xian to find some goose feathers and made her own feather pens. When she wanted to practice writing fancier characters or writing for longer amounts of time, she would switch to the feather pens. After filling up 2 sheets of paper with her calligraphy practice, Chu Lian made her way over to Qingxi Hall to give her daily greetings to the matriarch. Afterwards, she intended to stop by her mother-in-law's courtyard for a visit. Who could have known that Chu Lian would receive something she hadn't expected at all, a letter from He Changdi all the way from the northern border. Matriarch He had a wide smile on her face as she passed the letter over. She was acting just like she was watching her cute pair of grandchildren being lovey-dovey right in front of her. The corner of Chu Lian's mouth twitched. She kept her expression neutral as she took the letter, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. The matriarch mistook this as Chu Lian simply being shy, so she dismissed her with a wave of a hand to let her read the letter in private. Matriarch He even reminded her to write a reply after she was finished reading. The man who had brought them the letters was still waiting to send everyone's replies back together to the northern border. Seeing Matriarch He's pleased expression, Chu Lian felt like she was out of her depth. When she recalled what Senior Servant Liu had told her last night while escorting her back to Songtao Court, Chu Lian's mood took a turn for the worse. Senior Servant Liu's words played again in her mind. "Third young madam, please don't blame this old servant for speaking up about this. The Countess hasn't been in the best of health since the birth of third young master, so this old servant was the one who took care of him from childhood. This old servant feels warm just watching the two of you interact so well. But now, third young master must be suffering over at the northern border, and our master can't help him either. He's all alone over there without a companion he can share his troubles with. Although it's been so hot as of late over here in the capital, it's actually terribly cold over there, especially at night. I've heard that it's impossible to survive without a jacket on. Third young master left in such a hurry. This old servant doesn't know if he brought enough supplies." After Senior Servant Liu had dragged on in this vein, Chu Lian instantly understood. She only had one purpose. That was to make Chu Lian, as Sanlang's wife, send more care for the He family's lonely, suffering third young master. If she could be a caring and considerate wife, and prepare some changes of clothing and such for her dear husband, it would be great. As much as Chu Lian wanted to roll her eyes, she couldn't say anything to Senior Servant Liu. She could tell that Senior Servant Liu genuinely cared for He Changdi. She treated him like her very own son. There was nothing wrong with those kinds of feelings. Chu Lian agreed to it. Despite how terribly He Changdi acted in front of her, she was still his legitimate wife. There were expectations she had to fulfill according to that role. As for that crazy husband of hers, as long as he wasn't around to disturb her, there was nothing to worry about. Chu Lian's thoughts were plain and simple. When she returned to her study, Chu Lian sat alone at her desk. She measured the thickness of the envelope with her fingers. It seemed pretty thick. There must be quite a few pieces of paper in there. TL note, food porn is back, in vegetarian style. XD vegetarian wraps, Vietnamese, vegetable porridge. Chapter 139. Reply 1. There were a few boldly written words on the front of the letter. To my dear wife, Madam Chu. A corner of Chu Lian's lips lifted in amusement. She wondered if he felt any guilt at all while writing that down. Calling her his dear wife. Yeah, right? He hadn't even been willing to consummate their marriage. Did he have a conscience somewhere in that head of his or not? Chu Lian tore open the letter and pulled out a few pieces of paper. Now that she could see the contents, he really had written a whole stack of letters to her. Each page was packed with tiny little words. She had to get as close as possible to decipher them. But the moment she tried, Her face instantly turned dark. What the heck was this? The handwriting on these letters were so bad that they looked like exorcism amulets. She couldn't understand a single one. No, wait. She was able to understand 2 words. The big, bold words at the start of the letter. Chu-Lien. After that warm, my dear wife on the front of the envelope, he Sanling still ended up addressing her by her full name, Chu-Lien, in the letter itself. Even though she couldn't really make out what the letter was about, just based on those 2 words alone, Chu-Lien could understand that he Sanling hadn't written anything good about her in that letter. She pursed her lips. Luckily, He Changda's handwriting was so terrible that she couldn't read the letter. Otherwise, she would have probably gotten angry and expired from the force of her rage. She carefully folded up the letter and placed it back into the envelope, then tucked it away in a fragrant rosewood box. Then, Chu-Lien prepared some ink and picked up her brush to start writing a reply. He Changdi had written out 3 whole pages while full of anger, all to warn the wicked woman Chu-Lien against trying any of her tricks while he was gone. If he were to find out that she hadn't even read a single word of it, perhaps he might even spew out a mouthful of blood. If he were to also find out that it was all because of his flowery handwriting, perhaps he might also regret trying his best to show off his calligraphy skills. After thinking for a long time, Chu-Lien still didn't know what to write as a reply to He Changdi. She wrote a few words, before staring at the remaining blank space on the paper. Her eyebrows furrowed together, and she quickly scrunched the paper up into a ball and threw it into the fire. No way, it was impossible. Although her handwriting had improved, it was still miles apart from someone who should be used to writing with a brush. It wouldn't be good to expose her lack of skills to He Changdi by writing a letter. What if he started getting suspicious? That husband of hers was already crazy enough. She couldn't risk provoking him anymore. Since she couldn't write, how was she supposed to reply He Sanling's letter? Chu-Lien scratched her head in frustration. Somehow, her gaze landed on the set of goose feather pins and charcoal that she usually used for practicing. Her eyes instantly lit up. Oh yes, although she couldn't write, she could draw. For an art enthusiast like her, those simple little comics with 4 boxes were easy as pie. Now that she had a plan, Chu-Lien immediately started putting it into action. She took up her brush and with a few strokes, a lively, interesting drawing started to take shape on the paper. The little person wearing a dress with a lopsided hairstyle was herself. With a few simple, quick lines and some nice brush strokes, the paper was filled with quite the animated scene. In less than an hour, Chu-Lien had already drawn 20 comics. She couldn't even fit the whole stack into the envelope. Finally, Chu-Lien called Xian into the study. Xian, help me find a larger envelope. Xian was still dazed by the request. She was wondering what Chu-Lien needed such a thing for. If she wanted to mail something larger, she could just use a package. Chu-Lien waved the stack of paper at Xian, and the maidservant immediately understood. TL note, food porn in 2 more chapters. Chapter 140. Reply 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Xian hurried out with a smile on her face to look for another envelope. She bumped into Senior Servant Gue outside the bedroom. Senior Servant Gue found it strange that the normally calm maidservant had a bright smile on. Xian chuckled. Momo, you should have seen it. The size of the reply that Third Young Madam has written for Third Young Master's letter. It can't fit in a normal envelope, so this servant is going to find a much bigger envelope to fit it in. As Xian was speaking, she even gestured with her fingers to show how thick the stack was, with some exaggeration, of course. Senior Servant Gue chuckled along with her. She recalled that Third Young Master had sent back a letter for their Third Young Madam. It must have been something he'd written that had made her so happy. Why else would Third Young Madam have so many things to say? Her reply couldn't even fit in a normal envelope. Good, that's good. This old servant will help search for one as well. In the end, they had to make a request to the steward of the outer court for one. The fact was that such big envelopes were rarely used, so they didn't have any in the estate. In the end, it was the steward who used leather to fashion one in a stroke of genius. There was a special feeling to it when Chu-Lien held it in her hands, almost like the file holders back in the modern era. Senior Servant Gue, and Xian happily watched as Chu Lian personally put the thick stack of papers into the envelope and sealed it. She even wrote the words, "To my dear Sanlang," on the front. The two servants imagined their third young madam stuffing the entirety of her sweet little heart into that large envelope. Remembering senior servant Lu's special reminder, Chu Lian had senior servant Gue find a cloth for wrapping up a package. She packed up a few of He Changdi's inner clothes, cloaks, winter clothing, shoes, and so on. These had already been made for He Changdi anyway, so Chu Lian didn't need to do a single thing. Senior servant Zhong was also present in the room. A corner of her lips lifted in appreciation. In her heart, she nodded. Third young madam really did have third young master in her heart. She even knew to pack up some clothes for her husband. The courier had already told them that he could help bring some things over, but not too much, or it wouldn't be very convenient for him. Matriarch, he also knew how strict the army camps at the northern border were, so she didn't try to make things difficult for the courier. She even specially told Chu Lian of the package limit. After preparing a small bundle of things, senior servant Zhong had already brought the younger maidservants out to the kitchen to prepare dinner. Senior servant Gue thought for a while before deciding to stay behind. She helped Chu Lian tidy up the bundle before commenting, "Third young madam, this old servant heard that the northern border is extremely barren. There's not much to have there. Third young master must be used to a comfortable life here in the capital. He might not be able to get used to the northern border. It's possible that his appetite is suffering as well. He must surely miss the fine cuisine back here in the capital." Chu Lian couldn't understand what senior servant Gue was trying to say. She tilted her head in confusion as she looked at senior servant Gue. Her eyes were bright and moist, and she even made a cute sound in questioning. "Didn't he decide to go there by himself? He didn't even tell me beforehand. It's none of my business, even if he suffers there." Senior servant Gue sighed inwardly. That's not what this old servant meant. This old servant was simply saying that third young master is most likely not sleeping or eating well. "Didn't you have Xian and the other girls make some snacks a few days ago?" Only those who were fortunate enough to taste the splendors of Chu Lian's secret recipes would know the temptation of food. As the saying went, the primary necessity of the people is food. In the ranking of all of life's pleasures, food was number one. Just take senior servant Gue for example. After getting used to eating the dishes made from third young madam's recipes, she would probably look down on even the most famous restaurant in the whole entire capital now. Those fine cuisines were complete garbage when compared to the food here at Songtao Court. Their third young madam wasn't good at much. In the past, she had some skill in brewing sancha, but since she refused to even touch the tea now, this was the last remaining skill that she could show off. Who didn't like to eat in this world? Especially good food. No one could possibly dislike it. There was nothing good to eat over at the northern border. If third young madam were to send something nice along, wouldn't third young master be tremendously happy? TL note, food porn in one more chapter. Chapter 141. Reply 3. After listening to senior servant Gue, Chu Lian remembered that she had taught the girls how to make a whole bunch of snacks on a particularly boring day. Since they usually had some spare meat left in the kitchen that would spoil if they couldn't finish it, Chu Lian had the girls turn them into all sorts of meat-based snacks. There was pork jerky, translucent shredded beef, spiced beef jerky, and many more. This was the first time she had made these kinds of snacks since coming to the Great Wu Dynasty. There actually wasn't all that much meat left in the kitchen too, so they only had a few bags worth, even after spending all that effort to make them. Even the handmaids weren't given any. The jerky was meant only for her. That translucent shredded beef was still soaking in a small jar, waiting to be eaten in 2 days. However, senior servant Gue was now suggesting that she give all her hard-won snacks to He Changdi. How could the greedy Chu Lian bear to part with her food? "Momo, it wasn't easy for me to make those snacks. I haven't even eaten more than a few pieces. I've been craving them for so long. Anyway, that translucent shredded beef was just made. I don't know if it can be eaten now. What if it doesn't taste good?" Senior servant Gue hadn't thought that the usually generous third young madam, who could even bear to reward her servants with silver accessories without batting an eyelash, would suddenly turn into such a miser. She couldn't even bear to part with a few bags of snacks? Senior servant Gue felt helpless. She knew that third young madam's childish temper was going to flare up again, so she patiently tried to persuade her. Third young madam, how could anything you made not taste good? Don't worry, this old servant has tasted it already. That translucent shredded beef is delicious. Chu Lian's eyes widened in disbelief. She pointed at senior servant Gue and said poutily, Momo, you ate my shredded beef in secret. Senior servant Gue didn't expect that she would expose herself in a moment of carelessness. She awkwardly continued, this old servant simply tasted it a little. Didn't third young madam say before that it would be done after soaking for 4 to 5 days? This old servant was simply helping third young madam conduct a taste check first. Chu Lian was extremely put out. She had been wondering why her beef jerky had been running out so quickly. So it was senior servant Gue who had been sneakily eating some. Why were the people around her such gluttons for food? Wasn't it enough having just one glutton around? Senior servant Gue realized that they had strayed from the topic at hand, so she quickly pushed it back to the right track. It was this old servant's fault for stealing third young madam's snacks. This old servant promises not to steal any more snacks and to watch over Xian and the rest. Third young madam, there isn't much left, and it won't be enough for you anyway. Besides, we can make them anytime here. If you send it to third young master, and he likes it, he might even begin to long for you. It'll all be thanks to these snacks. If you send them along. Chu Lian was a little motivated by senior servant Gui's words. That was true. She could make them any time she wanted, but it was impossible for Changdi up in the north. It was also true that there wasn't much left anyway, as much as she liked them. She was simply trying to have some other flavors to spice up her usual meals. Fine, she would give the remainder to Changdi. All right, Momo, get Xian to bring the snacks over. Put them into a small bag alone and ask the courier to take special care of it. Very well, this old servant will do so now. Senior servant Gue quickly rushed off to find Xian. The pork and beef jerky had a long shelf life as long as they were careful about not letting them touch water. Thus, Chu Lian wasn't afraid of the food spoiling before it reached the northern border. TL note, return of food porn. When I search for these, it turns out that there are lots of brands for all these snacks out there. Maybe you guys can try buying some and letting me know how they taste. I've only had pork jerky before out of these 3 snacks here. 3 poor Chu Lian getting her precious snacks stolen. Or's translucent shredded beef, pork jerky, spiced beef jerky. Chapter 142. Jealousy 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Xian was also happy that third young madam was finally thinking about third young master. In her excitement, she took out all of Chu Lian's snacks and packed them up, including a few pretty little blue cloth bags and the small jar of translucent shredded beef. Though it wasn't much, it was just enough for a small package. On the other hand, when senior servant Gue looked at the package, she felt that it was too small. Wouldn't sending such a small amount reflect badly on their young madam? Thus, she took the initiative to take out the grape wine that Chu Lian had fermented a few days ago. After adding 1 bottle into the package, senior servant Gue was satisfied. Poor Chu Lian didn't know that all of her snacks had been offered up by Xian. Not even her grape wine, which hadn't been easy to make either, was left untouched by these 2. Once both the letter and package had been prepared, they were sent on their way to the outer court. By then, the entire estate knew that Chu Lian was going to send a giant letter to He Sanlang. The main steward retold the story in front of the other stewards, boasting that he had personally made that huge envelope for third young madam's letter. The faces of matriarch He, Countess Jingen, and heir Jingen were filled with gratified smiles upon hearing this bit of news. They praised Chu Lian, exclaiming that Sanlang had really married a good wife. Thus, the letters that the other family members intended to send to He Changdi were full of praise for Chu Lian, noting that she was both sensible and filial. It was probably only Madame Zhou's letter that didn't contain something nice about her. All of House Jingen's letters and packages were quickly sent to the northern border. Within the study room of Prince Jin's estate, the usually cheerful Tang Yin had lost his smile. His expression was extremely grave. He glanced towards the seemingly relaxed Prince Jin, sitting at the head of the room with his eyes closed and resting. Your Highness, the city guards just sent some news over. The assassins we captured all died overnight. Prince Jin's startlingly blue eyes instantly flickered open. Have you found any leads? All of the assassins had a black imprint on their left arm. After examining the bodies, we suspect that the imprints are part of a secret technique from the previous dynasty to control kamikaze warriors. Send people to continue the investigation. Check on the background of Defeng Tea House as well. Tang Yin indicated that he had received his orders and left. Prince Jin's long, elegant fingers tapped gently on the table before him. His eyes seemed to have darkened, showing hidden depths. Everything that happened in Defeng Tea House played in Prince Jin's mind once again. He hadn't forgotten how Chu Lian had been able to recognize him at first glance back then. Although he was part of the imperial family, and even held the status of fourth prince, he wasn't as favored as the other princes. His mother had passed away long ago, and his mother's maiden family was too weak. Thus, he had no support to speak of. He was already 18 this year, and had left the palace 2 years earlier to establish his own estate. After moving out, other than for the major court meetings held twice every month, he didn't enter the palace often. In their earlier years, he and He Changdi had regularly visited the military camp located in the outskirts of the city, so he was familiar with most of the military officials at court. Otherwise, he couldn't possibly have arranged a position for He Changdi at Liangzhou. However, the Great Wu dynasty favored literary officials over the military. Thus, not many cared that he was making connections with the military officials. Due to his uncommon eye color, the emperor had already told him in private that a prince with mixed blood would never be accepted in the competition for the throne. Thus, Prince Jin had never sought to fight for it, even in his younger days. This was also the main reason he had been given an official title of prince and sent out of the palace to establish his own estate much earlier than the rest. Perhaps in 2 more years he would take a wife and be sent off to some other territory, but for now, he was allowed to spend his days in the capital mostly idle. Prince Jin's abnormal eyes were one of the taboos in the imperial family. With his reclusiveness, not many people knew of this strange trait of his apart from some trusted officials at court. Even if people found out about this fact, few of them would dare to discuss it openly. As much as Prince Jin wasn't favored, he was still one of the imperial sons carrying the bloodline of the emperor. Despite this, Chu Lian had been able to identify him at first glance. Sixth Miss Chu had simply been a forgotten little miss of Housingwa before her marriage. She had probably never attended any important feasts in her entire life. He Sanling wouldn't have mentioned him to her either. And judging from He Sanling's attitude towards her during the first few days, did he really seem like someone who would share intimate details of his life with Sixth Miss Chu? Not at all. Prince Jin hadn't been dressed like a prince that day in Defeng Tea House. However, Chu Lian had been able to tell who he was the moment she had met his gaze after coming out of her private compartment. She had clearly recognized him. This was getting interesting. He Sanlang, you've been pretty fortunate to have picked up such an interesting wife. Not only was she in contact with some strange man, she seemed to be hiding a lot of secrets. Prince Jin didn't dare to guess at what Sixth Miss Chu was thinking. However, it was a fact that Chu Lian had sent her servant to bring the city guards back, saving his life. Prince Jin knew how to repay his debts. He wouldn't refuse to acknowledge Chu Lian's efforts in saving him just because his good friend, He Changdi, happened to despise her. Chapter 143. Jealousy, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian spent 2 peaceful days in the estate. She was already starting to consider the revival plan for Gillen Restaurant. In 2 more days, she would ask Matriarchy for permission to go out and take a look at the restaurant herself. It was almost mid-autumn soon. The estate was starting to prepare the necessary items for the colder months ahead. The temperature outside was getting lower, thanks to a few rounds of autumn rain, and it had become much cooler. After having breakfast at Songtao Court in the morning, Chu Lian gave her morning greetings to Matriarchy as usual. She bumped into Madame Zhou while she was there. Matriarchy took a sip of tea. Perhaps due to the coming of autumn, Matriarchy had added some dried chrysanthemum flowers into her sencha today, giving it a fresh burst of flavor. While looking at the floating yellow petals in her tea, Matriarchy suddenly remembered something. She immediately said, "It's almost autumn now. It's about time for all the courtyards to get additional clothes made." Dalong's wife, "Have you finished the preparations?" Madame Zhou had just picked up her cup of tea. She hadn't expected Matriarch He to mention this matter to her so abruptly, but she quickly replied, "Please don't worry about it, grandmother. The steward in charge of the needlework has already mentioned it to me. I've already given them my orders. The new clothes for this season will be made in the most trendy styles of the capital." After saying so, she turned to look at Chu Lian, who was sitting opposite her. Her eyes seemed to dim a little before she continued to say, "Third sister-in-law has just married in this year, and she's so young and pretty. I took the initiative to add 3 more sets of clothing for third sister-in-law. Does grandmother have any other requests?" It seemed like Madame Zhou's reply had satisfied Matriarch He. You've done well, Dalong's wife. Since Sanlang isn't in the capital, we should be taking care of Sanlang's wife as her senior family members. In my opinion, when it's time for each courtyard to get new accessories, why don't you add 2 more sets for Sanlang's wife? This granddaughter-in-law understands." Although Madame Zhou replied positively, beneath the surface, she had taken offense. Giving Chu Lian a few more sets of clothing was already considered special treatment. Now she even had to order more accessories to be made for her. A single set of clothes wouldn't cost more than 100 taels, regardless of the quality of the material used. However, one set of accessories could cost at least 100 or more. They would have to be high quality, too. Upon thinking that Matriarch He had suddenly added on 500 to 600 taels of expenses with just one sentence, Madame Zhou felt extremely put off. Matriarch He didn't know the cost of things since she wasn't managing the household accounts. The stores and fields that the estate had under their name didn't produce much annual income for them. None of the masters present in the Jing'an estate knew how to manage businesses, so after deducting the necessary expenses for upkeep and maintaining connections with other houses, they didn't have much money left. Once Countess Jing'an used up her own funds, her medicine expenses would be shifted to the general accounts. 1,000 taels a month was not a small sum. By then, it would be hard to manage this estate. When Madame Zhou thought back to when she had first married into the estate, she recalled that Matriarch He had never treated her this well. Jealousy and frustration took root in Madame Zhou's heart. Chu Lian wanted to say something, but it wasn't her turn to speak. She could see that the look in Madame Zhou's eyes was changing and cried bitterly in her heart. "Ah, my dear grandmother, aren't you creating trouble for me? How could their third branch get any extra accessories when the main branch wasn't getting any?" Chu Lian was about to speak up and reject the offer when Matriarch He cut her off. "Sanlang's wife is so young. It's just the right time for her to dress up. A few accessories shouldn't cost too much. Furthermore, our estate should be able to spare that much." The matriarch's gaze landed on Chu Lian's abdomen. Chu Lian choked and couldn't bring herself to speak. What else could she say? The matriarch had already had the final word. Madame Zhou, who had her eyes trained on Matriarch He, immediately caught the look she shot towards Chu Lian. Alarm bells rang in her head. She couldn't help the frustration she felt pressing like a heavy weight on top of her chest. Her face flushed red from the strength of her emotions. After Chu Lian and Madame Zhou headed to Countess Jing'an's courtyard together for a visit, Matriarch He called her trusted senior servant Zhou over. She asked in a casual tone, "Is there any news about Sanlang's wife?" Senior servant Zhou's face crinkled up and she replied with difficulty, "I heard that third young madam had her monthlies yesterday." Matriarch He's face was filled with disappointment. It looked like the great-grandson she had been looking forward to wasn't coming this year. Senior servant Zhou tried to comfort her. "Matriarch, although third young madam comes from House Ingwa, third young master only stayed a few days after they got married. How could she fall pregnant that easily?" Matriarch He sighed, looking crestfallen. "You're right, I was too hasty." When Chu Lian took her leave a step ahead of Madame Zhou, Countess Jing'an kept Madame Zhou back, intending to say a few words in private. "Mother, is anything the matter?" Countess Jing'an's face was pale as she leaned against the headboard of her bed. Every once in a while, she would cough. As she held onto Madame Zhou's hands, she slowly said, "It's almost time for the seasons to change. Since it's almost autumn, there are many preparations to be done around the estate. It must have been tough on you." "Mother, what are you saying?" It's all part of my duty. Madame Zhou felt comforted by her mother-in-law's words. The lingering frustration she felt from Qingxi Hall began to dissipate, and she managed to squeeze out a refreshed smile. Mother has also been in your position, and Mother knows how tiring it must be. While working to keep our estate running, don't forget to take care of your own body. I understand, Mother. After a short pause, Countess Jing'an spoke up again. Sanlang's wife has just joined our family. As her eldest sister-in-law, do take care of her a little more. Why don't you give her an extra set of accessories this season? The rage that had just been quelled instantly flared up again. So her mother-in-law had simply been saying those comforting words to pad her request for Chu Lian. Huh. How nice. All the senior family members were thinking of the third branch. Wasn't it just because Sanlang had gone off to the northern border? But that was Sanlang's own choice to go. Shouldn't the blame be placed on Chu Lian for not managing to keep him here? All of them wanted her to help make up for Sanlang's absence, but who was going to make up this slight to her? She and Chu Lian were both legitimate wives of the estate. Chapter 144. Chillis 1. After Madame Zhou had finished agreeing to her mother-in-law's requests, she walked out of Countess Jing'an's courtyard with a tense, fearsome expression. The servants following behind were so afraid that they didn't even dare to breathe. Madame Zhou suddenly paused in her steps and turned around to ask the senior servant behind her, "How is it? Is there any news from Songtao Court?" This senior servant was well aware that her mistress wasn't in the best of moods today, and it would be far too easy to make it even worse. So when her mistress asked her a question she could answer without fear, the senior servant breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Eldest young madam, please don't worry." This old servant heard that third young madam's schedule ran as usual. After getting a definite answer, the knot in Madame Zhou's heart finally loosened. How fortunate. How lucky that Chu Lian hadn't gotten pregnant. If Chu Lian were to get pregnant and give birth to the eldest grandson of the house, how would she be able to keep her position as the wife of Heir Jing'an? That's right. Did Heir Jing'an say when he would be coming back today? One of the maidservants behind her answered. Heir Jing'an said he would be going to Honglu Temple this morning. It seems like he's meeting with some outsiders there. When he left, he mentioned that there'd be no need to wait for him for the midday meal. Tell the kitchen to prepare his share anyway. How can the food of those restaurants outside possibly compare to the food of our estate? Yes, eldest young madam. This servant will send the orders now. Her senior servant walked forward to support Madame Zhou's arm. With some emotion in her voice, she said, "Eldest young madam is always so considerate. I believe Heir Jing'an will be able to feel eldest young madam's painstaking care when he comes back." Madame Zhou's expression was still a little dark upon hearing these words from her trusted servant. Dalong did treat her very well. If her body wasn't up for it, Dalong would only rest in his study, and he would never summon one of the maidservants to quell his urges. She probably wouldn't be able to find more than a handful of men who could control themselves like this in the entire capital. One of House Jing'an's rules prohibited the men from taking concubines unless they were still without an heir upon turning 30. For Dalong, that age was fast approaching, and she still had yet to give him any sons. Were the happy days of their peaceful, loving marriage about to end just like that? The more she thought about it, the more her worry showed in her eyes. He Changqi was meant to inherit the title of Count Jing'an. How could he not have any heirs of his own? Even if he Changqi didn't mind it, the Count and Countess, as well as Matriarch He, couldn't possibly not mind. The grape wine that Chu Lian had been fermenting for the past few days was now ready to drink. Since senior servant Gue had taken the initiative to send off one of her gourds to He Changdi, Chu Lian was a little angry. She held on to her remaining wine gourd and kept eating long past her usual amount during the midday meal. As a result, she ate too much and her stomach was a little bloated now. It wouldn't be good for her body if she immediately went to nap, so she brought Wenqing and Jingyan along with her for a walk in the gardens to digest her meal. Although it was close to mid-autumn, it was still a little hot outside. Chu Lian favored walking along the more cool corridors, and somehow made it all the way to the entrance that connected the inner and outer courts. There was a set of stone tables and chairs in the bamboo forest near the entrance, so Chu Lian stopped and sat for a short rest. She intended to head back for a nap afterwards. Right as Chu Lian sat down, she heard the sounds of an ongoing conversation near the outer court exit. Who knew her original plan would be derailed just like that? Erjingon, what should we do with this whole carriage of Chillis? Your heart is too soft. You bought up his entire stock just because that outsider claimed he didn't have enough money to go back. Hand it over to the estate steward. If they're really useless, just throw them away. That kid was so pitiful. I just wanted to give him some money to help him get home. It was the slightly coarse voice of Dalong that spoke. Chapter 145. Chillis, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian couldn't quite make out what they were saying, but she could recognize her eldest brother-in-law's voice, so she was a little curious. Thus, she sent Winching off to ask about what was going on. In a short moment, He Changchi walked over with his manservant, Kang Shou. Chu Lian quickly stood up to greet him. Third sister-in-law, how did you come to be here in the middle of the day? Chu Lian smiled. Replying to eldest brother-in-law, I ate too much in the afternoon, so I'm taking a walk in the gardens to digest my meal. I walked all the way here without realizing and happened to notice eldest brother-in-law's voice outside, so I sent my maidservant over to check. Eldest brother-in-law, where did you go? Have you taken your midday meal? Chu Lian looked sweet and pretty, adding on to the fact that she had been quiet and obedient after marrying into the estate, as well as having earned a good reputation for herself at the Dingyuan estate. He Changchi had a very positive impression of this newlywed sister-in-law of his. He was so used to being the eldest sibling that he would dote on the younger members of the family even more. Although he looked a little fierce on the outside, he had a kind heart. Chu Lian was his little brother's wife. With He Changchi's character, of course he treated her like his own younger sister. I've already had my lunch. I went over to Honglu Temple this morning to meet some outsider friends. Third sister-in-law, did you know? Those outsiders really do have red hair and green eyes. He Changchi spoke in such an interesting manner that Chu Lian's eyes brightened with interest. Eldest brother-in-law, did you eat the food the outsiders made? Of course. Is their food very different from what we eat in our Great Wu dynasty? After hearing Chu Lian's questions, a constipated expression came over He Changchi's face. Combined with the tan of his skin and his large build, he looked exactly like a pouting bear. It was very funny, but Chu Lian and her maidservants managed to hold back their laughter, thanks to their status. That meal. Let's not talk about it. It tasted so bad that he wanted to tear up. After eating that strange meal, He Changchi had started to pity those outsiders. Otherwise, he wouldn't have spent tens of taels to buy that carriage of useless Chillis. He recalled what those outsiders had said, that those Chillis were a type of food. However, after he and Kang Shou had a bite, their mouths were on fire. They had to gulp down 2 whole cups of tea to even come close to calming the burning of their tongues. Casting a look over the curious and sparkly-eyed sister-in-law of his, He Changchi had a sudden idea. That's right, I bought something from those outsiders today. They told me it was a type of food. Does third sister-in-law want to take a look? Chu Lian happened to be super curious about it, so how could she reject the offer? Thus, she followed He Changchi through the entrance to the outer court. He Changchi waved his hand at the 2 manservants moving some goods out of the carriage. He Changchi lead her over, and when they got close enough, he personally took up one of the cloth sacks and opened it up for her. Chu Lian peeked in, only to see that the bag was full of dried Chillis. Their skins were red and shiny, and they had teeny tips. Cute. Chu Lian tried to stay calm, but she couldn't help but get excited at the sight. Eldest brother-in-law, what are these? He Changchi seemed to feel that these goods weren't useful at all. He simply twisted the sack closed before tossing it back onto the carriage. The outsiders who sold this to me told me they're called Chillis. Chu Lian had to gulp down the saliva that had unconsciously begun to pool in her mouth. I wonder if eldest brother-in-law could give me some of these Chillis? I want to use them as ingredients to cook with. To cook with? When Chu Lian mentioned food, He Changchi remembered the snacks that she had made over the past few days. These Chillis were useless to him anyway, so why not give them to Chu Lian? Third sister-in-law, if you want them, you can have them all. These things are useless to me. Chu Lian hadn't expected her eldest brother-in-law to give her the whole lot just like that, so she was a little shocked. She wanted to reject the offer, but He Changqi's manservant spoke up. Third young madam, these chillis aren't worth much. They're just some goods that a young outsider brought into the capital. He wanted to sell it for a good price, but he didn't expect that no one even wanted to buy them. He was in a rush to go home, so he came to Jing'an looking for help. Jing'an took pity on him and gave him some tails so he could go home. This carriage of chillis just happened to be something extra. If you don't want these, the steward is most likely going to toss everything away. TL note: I'll be translating today's bonus chapters starting now. I'll post them as I finish them. Come chat with me in the general voice channel on Volari's Discord server. I'll also be checking TMR's discussion channel, #TMRNeverComes, for anyone who can't join the voice channel. Here's the invite link, https://discord. GG/P76AXMR. Also, have a Merry Christmas today, everyone. Love. Chapter 146. Chillis, 3. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. No one had managed to recognize what a good ingredient these were. No wonder the outsider had to sell it for so little. Since they had gotten these chillis so cheaply, Chu Lian didn't continue to decline the offer. To be honest, this carriage of chillis would only be able to reach their full potential in her hands. Then many thanks to eldest brother-in-law. If I cook anything new with these chillis, I'll send a share over to eldest brother-in-law. It's a deal then. Kong Shou, call up 2 female servants to move all these chillis to Songtao Court's kitchen. After giving away the burdensome chillis, He Changqi felt refreshed. He then returned to his own courtyard with his manservant. Of course, Madame Zhou had already received the news of what had happened. Madame Zhou sat in the parlor with an unhappy expression, clearly angry. The moment He Changqi entered the parlor, he noticed that his wife didn't seem to be in a good mood. He walked over and took a seat by Madame Zhou. Yuanjing, what happened? Did any of those silly servants make you angry today? Madame Zhou felt even more frustrated upon hearing him say that, but she couldn't bear to take out her temper on her dear husband. She could only smooth out her expression and quietly ask, Dalong, you brought a carriage full of something back from Honglu Temple today? Although He Changqi looked like a rough man, contrary to his appearance, he was very sensitive to the hidden meanings behind words. Thus, he immediately realized that his wife's thoughts had gone down the wrong path. Oh, what are you thinking? Those were just some goods that some outsider kid didn't manage to sell off. He brought them all the way here to our capital, but couldn't manage to sell off his stock for an entire half a year. I took pity on him and spent 20 taels to buy those, just to give him some money to help him get home. When Madame Zhou heard this, she relaxed. What was it? Just a carriage full of some chillis. Women were still a little more narrow-minded. Even Madame Zhou, who had grown up in House Dingyuan, wasn't an exception to the rule. She hit He Changqi lightly. Even so, you can't give all of it to third sister-in-law. If I don't give them to her, am I supposed to just throw them away? I don't know what to do with them, and you don't know what to use them for either. Even if we keep them, they'll just spoil. It's just 20 taels. Why do you care? Madame Zhou couldn't stand it anymore. She turned her back to He Changqi. All right. Yuan Jing, I'll bring a headdress back for you tomorrow. How about that? It's the latest style from Jinshi Pavilion. I ordered it for you a few days ago. Now that I think about it, it's about time for it to be done. Once Madame Zhou heard that her husband had ordered a headdress for her from Jinshi Pavilion, that paltry sum of 20 taels was completely tossed to the back of her head. She quickly started questioning He Changqi about what the accessory was made of and the style it was made in. Jinshi Pavilion was the most famous accessory store in the whole capital. Even princesses and influential officials' wives often ordered accessories there. Having a headdress from Jinshi Pavilion was something worth showing off. He Changqi's words had finally assuaged the depression that Madame Zhou had been in, thanks to Matriarch He and Countess Jing'an's talk about giving Chu Lian more accessories. After eating a little with his wife, He Changqi went to his study with his servant, Kong Shou. He Changqi sat before his desk and instructed, Kong Shou, Take 1,000 taels over to Jinshi Pavilion and get them to make a headdress for me. Tell the shopkeeper that this order is from me, and I won't tolerate any mistakes. Kang Shou was about to turn and leave when Changqi called him back. Don't take the money from the estate's accounts. Take it from my personal funds. Yes, sir. Kang Shou quickly left to perform the errand. Changqi was a little worried over his finances now. It wasn't like he didn't have any personal funds, but these days, he had been secretly helping out with his mother's medicine expenses. Even if he had a mountain of gold, it would run out eventually. He had already detected his wife's unhappiness, so he chose to use a headdress to soothe her ruffled feelings. How could he have possibly have ordered it in advance? He had only said so to make Madame Zhou happy. Chapter 147, Poached Fish Slices, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. If his father wasn't stationed at Mingzhou, and if the heir didn't have to be around for the family, Changqi would have actually preferred to join the army himself. However, since he was the eldest son, he had to let go of his dream and stay at home to take up the responsibility of his absent father. Changqi's position was merely a slack fourth-ranked official. He wasn't good at business either, so although he was House Jing'an's heir, he didn't have much funds at hand. As the heir to a count's estate, the only reason he had started worrying about money was because of his mother's condition. Chu Lian didn't know any of this, as she wasn't managing any part of the estate. It was all happening in the background. The original story hadn't made any mention of these details either. After getting a full carriage of chilies, Chu Lian was dying of happiness. Her mind was already full of chili oil, spicy spring chicken, boiled mutton, sour and spicy soup, fried spicy shredded beef, mapo tofu, and all the other spicy dishes she could think of. When she got back to Songtao Court, she immediately rushed into the small kitchen without bothering with an afternoon nap. At the entrance of the kitchen, senior servant Zhong and Wanlan were staring wide-eyed and tongue-tied at the servants carrying in sacks of something into the kitchen. That carriage of chilies managed to fill up half of their small storehouse. Senior servant Zhong went up to Chu Lian and asked while gaping in shock, "Third young madam, what is all this? Why is there so much of it?" Chu Lian smiled so widely that her eyes had narrowed into slits. She purposely skirted around the topic and said, "Momo, don't worry, it's something good. Eldest brother-in-law gave them to me." From Heir Jing'an? Senior servant Zhong followed behind Chu Lian and watched as she opened up a sack and got Jingyan to bring some big wooden basins over. Chu Lian then held up the sack that went up to her knee and poured out the dried chilies, making a satisfying sound as they fell en masse into the basin. Senior servant Gue rushed over after getting the news. Upon seeing this basin of fiery red somethings, she exclaimed in surprise, "What are these? They actually look kind of pretty." Chu Lian reached out and ran her hand over the stack of chilies. Looking at all the fresh, bright red chilies, a mischievous thought sprang up in her mind. She turned to look at her gathered servants with upturned eyes and said, "This is a food from the outside. They're edible even without cooking. Would you like to try some?" The first ones to nod were the younger maidservants, Shiyin, Fuyin, and the others. Their eyes were full of expectation. Third young madam was just too good at cooking. Whatever she made was always delicious. They even thought they looked a little chubbier in the mirror, and that was only with 2 days' worth of observations. Before each meal, they would tell themselves to eat a little less this time, but they just couldn't control themselves once they saw the food. It was extremely frustrating. When Chu Lian saw that they were willing to try out the chilies, and she couldn't hold back the smile on her lips, she stepped aside and let them reach into the basin. The younger maidservants took 1 dried chili each. After glancing at it once or twice, without asking about its flavor, they shoved it straight into their mouths. In less than 2 seconds, their throats were on fire. They quickly spat out the chilies and rushed into the kitchen to find some water to drink. Senior servants Gue and Zhong had watched the whole affair from the side. They were shocked silly when the maidservants took off. What just happened? Senior servant Gue wanted to follow after the maidservants to see if they were okay, but Chu Lian held her back while trying to suppress her smile. "Momo, it's okay. They'll be fine. All they did was eat a chili. Their tongues must be burning from the spiciness. They'll be just fine after drinking a few cups of cold water. After finishing her explanation, Chu Lian couldn't help but burst out into laughter. Senior servant Gue relaxed after hearing this. However, she shot a weird look at her young madam, who had been so mischievous as to prank the younger girls. Senior servant Zhong turned around and quickly instructed some other maidservants to fetch cold water for the girls in the kitchen to drink. When the younger maidservants returned, their eyes were red and full of tears. They shot pathetic looks at Chu Lian like they had been bullied. TL note, I can't stand spicy food myself, so I feel for the maidservants. TAD thanks to Chu Lian's craving for spicy dishes. Here's a mega load of hot food porn, dried chili peppers, chili oil, spicy spring chicken, boiled mutton sour, and spicy soup, fried spicy shredded beef, mapo tofu. Chapter 148, Poached Fish Slices, 3. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian purposely kept her expression straight, scolding them. Let's see if you'll dare to eat before thinking the next time. If you ever do something wrong, the punishment from now on will be to eat a whole bowl of these chilis. The younger maidservants quickly bowed their heads, not daring to make a peep. Even the expressions of senior servants Gue and Zhong instantly turned serious. Actually, Chu Lian had phrased her words like this on purpose. 2 days ago, for He Sanlang's package, Xian and the rest had taken her snacks and senior servant Gue had taken her wine without asking for her permission. Furthermore, ever since they had started cooking their own food to eat, since her recipes were so good, there would be some food missing from time to time. Chu Lian had only pretended not to notice, but recently, they had started overstepping their bounds too much. Although Xian and senior servant Gue had been acting on her behalf when giving away her snacks and wine for He Sanlang's package, they had to have rules in place. She was the actual mistress of Songtao Court, after all, and that was only within this courtyard. Outside was still the hierarchy of the larger Jing'an estate. It might be a small matter to take some food, but she couldn't let bad habits like this fester. Letting it pass would eventually lead to the servants becoming bolder and greedier. Chu Lian took this chance to knock some sense back into the servants of her courtyard, clearly asserting her stance. She was going to punish anyone who overstepped their bounds again, and even senior servant Gue was not exempt from this rule. Chu Lian's eyes swept over the gathered servants. After sensing that her warning had been taken seriously, she relaxed and her expression returned to her warm and friendly self. Fuyan, go and see if there's any fish in the kitchen today. Wanlan Mingyan, bring out 2 more basins to keep these chilis. Jingyan, bring me some sesame, garlic, scallions, and ginger. After she finished giving out orders, Chu Lian stood to one side and instructed the remaining handmaids on how to wash and chop the dried chilis. For the entire afternoon, Songtao Court was filled with a fragrant yet spicy aroma, making most of the people in the kitchen choke on the smell. Chu Lian got Xian to move out one of the wooden chairs to a spot under some wisteria plants. She held Gillen Restaurant's account book in her hands and made markings from time to time, all the while keeping an eye on the servants bustling around the lively kitchen. When she held her hand out, Xian quickly passed a delicate dish over, filled with little pieces of bitter gourd with toothpicks sticking out of them. Chu Lian picked up one of the pieces with a toothpick and felt refreshed. When Xian noticed her change in expression, she hurried forward to help massage Chu Lian's shoulders. Chu Lian would speak up every few moments, a little more to the left, and Xian would follow her orders. Chu Lian closed her eyes and relaxed. This was the ideal layabout's life for her. Not long after, Fu Yin and the rest walked in covered with the smell of grease and smoke. Their faces were flushed red from the heat and exertion. When they reached Chu Lian's side, they were coughing nonstop. Chu Lian purposely coughed into her fist and asked, "Is it all done?" Replying to third young madam, "The chili oil has been prepared according to your instructions. There are about 2 jars worth of oil in total. Once it has cooled down, we can pour it into the jars." Jingyan replied, "Since it's done, go back to your rooms to bathe and change. Wash off that smell on you." The maidservants acted like they had just been given amnesty and fled. Satisfied, Chu Lian ate another piece of bitter gourd. "Xian, have you taken a good look? This is the fate of anyone who dares to steal my food for the benefit of others. Don't worry, I still have sacks and sacks of chili left. Xian was scared stiff by Chu Lian's words. She tried to stay strong, but she couldn't hold it back in the end. Third young madam, this servant will not dare to touch your belongings without your permission in the future. Third young madam, please have mercy on this servant this one time. Chu Lian cast a glance at Xian. Xian, it's good that you understand. I hope you won't lose something bigger for the sake of a small gain. Although it wasn't easy to make those snacks, they were just something to fulfill a craving. Chu Lian wanted to use this opportunity to remind Xian that she had to protect whatever was entrusted to her safekeeping. If she were to make the same mistake again, there were punishments awaiting her. Chapter 149, Poached Fish Slices, 3. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. For the evening meal, Chu Lian personally cooked up some poached fish slices and a pot of sour and spicy soup. The rest of the dishes were what they normally had here in Songtao Court. The snow-white poached fish slices were placed on top of a fresh pile of bean sprouts, with bright red chilies scattered on top. When the slices were served, it was a feast for the eyes. The fish meat was soft and tender. Although there was a layer of chilies on it, it wasn't too spicy. Once that thin slice of fish entered her mouth, Chu Lian shut her eyes in pleasure as the corners of her lips lifted up. It was just a pity she was eating alone. A dish like this felt more magnificent when it was served up in a huge plate. However, since it was just her, she told Xian to put the fish in a small bowl. For the remainder of it, Chu Lian ordered Xian to split it into 2 portions and send them to Qingxi Hall and the main branch's courtyard. Senior Servant Gue personally delivered the portion for Qingxi Hall and was received by Senior Servant Liu. This is a new dish that Third Young Madam made today. This old servant was sent under Third Young Madam's orders to bring some over for the matriarch to have a taste. However, Third Young Madam also has a reminder. These poached fish slices are a little spicy, so if the spiciness is too much for the matriarch, a small taste will do. Senior Servant Liu smiled and acknowledged the message. She received the dish and passed it to the maidservant behind her to send to Matriarch He. Next, Senior Servant Liu personally escorted Senior Servant Gue out of the courtyard. Over at Dalong's courtyard, they also received their share of the poached fish slices. It just so happened that He Changqi was present. He Changqi opened the lid of the container, only to see a layer of red chilies on top. He exclaimed in surprise, "Is this made from those chilies I brought back this afternoon?" Replying to Jingen, "It is. Our third young madam personally cooked this dish and has a message. If these poached fish slices are too spicy, please don't eat too much of it. Since it's made from those chilies, I have to taste this properly." Before Xian had even left, He Changqi had already ordered the senior servants in his courtyard to start serving the evening meal. He clearly couldn't wait to taste what a dish made from these chilies would be like. The next day, when Chu Lian arrived at Qingxi Hall for her usual morning greetings, she bumped into her eldest brother-in-law, He Changqi. The matriarch smiled and let Chu Lian sit by her side, joking, "Your eldest brother specially waited for 20 minutes more for you to come over." Chu Lian found it strange, so she asked, "Eldest brother-in-law, is anything the matter?" He Changqi's broad, tan face seemed to flush a little as he pressed his lips together, too embarrassed to speak up. He could only turn to Matriarch He for help. "Look at you. It's just a small matter, and it's gotten you so flustered you can't even speak. Sanlang's wife married into our family, so you're her older brother now." Matriarch He pretended to scold He Changqi before taking Chu Lian's hand into her own and smiling. "Your eldest brother has some friends coming over as guests in 2 more days. After eating those poached fish slices you sent over last night, he thought that your cooking was delicious. Thus, he wanted to ask if you could help cook a meal to impress them." When inviting guests over, the host always had to have either fine food or fine wine prepared. Since secret recipes were regarded so preciously in this time, each estate always had at most 1 or 2 signature dishes to bring out for their guests. Previously, House Jingen had Cook Zhou's confections as their specialty. Now that Cook Zhou had passed, He Dalong felt that he didn't have any good food to impress his friends with. so he continued to delay the meal he owed them time after time. Now that he had this chance, he couldn't let it go. Chu Lian had thought that it would be something hard for her. If it was just adding 1 or 2 dishes for her eldest brother-in-law's guests, then that would be extremely easy. Chu Lian immediately nodded and agreed to the request. Dalong had finally gotten rid of the one thing weighing on his mind and was about to leave when senior servant Lu rushed in from outside. Matriarch, the outer court steward just sent over some news. There's someone from the palace requesting an audience. Tielno, these pics look so good. Poached fish slices with chili, a closer look. Chapter 150. Honored Lady, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Valera novels. Please read from the original source. Someone from the palace? Matriarch He and He Changchi exchanged confused gazes the moment they heard this news. The master of the estate was away at the border, and their heir only had a minor position at court. A family like theirs wouldn't usually get visitors from the palace. Even if Matriarch He were to send her token to the palace to request a visit, they would have to wait days for a reply, even though the matriarch was close friends with the Empress Dowager. Upon seeing their surprised faces, senior servant Lu quickly added a few more details. The steward said that it's one of the high-ranked eunuchs from the inner chambers. He's here to read out an imperial decree that he brought along with him. What? An imperial decree? This was even more startling to them. None of the masters of House Jing'an had ever done something worthy of getting an imperial decree. Although they were still extremely confused, Matriarch He sent the news out to all the masters of each courtyard, ordering them to gather in the parlor at the outer court to await the announcement of the imperial decree. In a short moment, the entire He family was kneeling on the floor inside the parlor. Chu Lian knelt behind Madame Zhou, according to rank. She lifted her head a little so she could see what happened next. The high-ranked eunuch cast a swift glance over the gathered crowd before he straightened, adjusted his sleeves, and took up the yellow imperial decree from a tray held by a lower-ranked eunuch. His sharp voice began to read, "By order from the heavens, as decreed by His Majesty, Madame Chu, the wife of House Jing'an's third son, He Changdi, has been recognized for her praiseworthy and beautiful spirit, peaceful and pure demeanor, as well as her quick wits and vast intelligence. Our great emperor, by his benevolence, hereby bestows upon Madame Chu the 5th-ranked title of Honored Lady, and grants the name Genie." Even before the eunuch finished, that one line was enough to stun everyone present. Even the old matriarch He, who had experienced more of the world, was staring with her eyes slightly widened. What was going on? How had Sanlang's wife acquired the title of Honored Lady in the blink of an eye? Even Chu Lian herself was in disbelief. Suddenly, she remembered what Royal Princess Duanjia had said to her back in Prince Wei's estate. "Just you wait. I'll get you a noble title later on." It seemed like this sudden bestowal of a noble title definitely had something to do with Royal Princess Duanjia. Chu Lian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She thought that the princess had just been joking. Who could have expected that she had really gotten her a ranked noble title? Although it was the lowest-ranked honored lady, it was bestowed upon her directly by the emperor. That kind of honor meant that she had far more clout compared to any feudal princess. Madame Zhou, who was kneeling in front of Chu Lian, was completely dumbfounded. She subconsciously glanced over her shoulder, as if there was still a chance that her sister-in-law was a different Chu Lian than the one being mentioned in the imperial decree. She only peeked a little before turning back around. However, what she saw didn't please her. Her hands were already clenched into 2 tight fists. An uncontrollable amount of envy and jealousy flooded her mind. Third sister-in-law had gotten such a great honor simply by going to Prince Wei's estate. If she had known earlier about it, she would have surely followed along with third sister-in-law when she went to Prince Wei's estate. Perhaps then she would be the one mentioned in this imperial decree, rather than Chu Lian. This honored lady title personally bestowed by the emperor would have been hers. After building a strong connection with Prince Wei's estate, even if she could no longer produce any more children, Dalong wouldn't be allowed to take any concubines. Though Chu Lian was kneeling behind Madame Zhou, she could sense that something wasn't quite right with her eldest sister-in-law's emotional state. However, she was unable to observe her and figure out why. She could only guess at the thoughts running through Madame Zhou's head right now. When the high-ranked eunuch had finished reading the imperial decree, he lifted the scroll with both hands and a wide smile. "Honored Lady Genie, please rise and receive the decree." Xian quickly helped Chu Lian stand up, and Chu Lian walked up to the front of the crowd. She then received the yellow imperial decree from the high-ranked eunuch with both hands. "We've troubled you." Chapter 151. Honored Lady 2. The high-ranked eunuch carefully looked over this newly minted Honored Lady Genie. A hint of befuddlement entered his eyes. He hadn't expected that this Honored Lady Genie would be so young. She looked like she had just recently come of age. Honored Lady Genie wasn't wearing even a speck of powder on her natural, lovely face. When she smiled, it felt like a warming spring breeze. She rated highly just on her looks alone, and seemed particularly matching with He-Sanlang the Fair. By this time, Matriarch He had been supported to her feet by some servants. She shot a look at Senior Servant Lu behind her, and Senior Servant Lu brought out a deep blue purse from her sleeve, passing it over to the high-ranked eunuch who had announced the good news. The eunuch smiled and accepted it. Matriarch He started to exchange pleasantries with the high-ranked eunuch. It turned out that this high-ranked eunuch had served by the Empress Dowager's side before, so Matriarch He had seen him once or twice while visiting the Dowager. It was at this moment that a younger eunuch walked out from behind the high-ranked eunuch and slightly bowed towards Chu Lian. "This servant greets Honored Lady Genie." Chu Lian's brows were slightly furrowed as she turned to look at this young eunuch. He was tall and slender with a high-nose bridge. While his facial features were handsome on their own, when placed together on his face, it just seemed a little off. While the eunuch's words were full of respect, Chu Lian could see the disdain he held in his eyes. "May I ask what business you have with me?" The corner of the eunuch's lips curled up. However, his features weren't softened by the smile. Conversely, his expression looked even more sinister and wretched. Replying to Honored Lady Genie, "This servant works in Yonghe Hall, and this servant heard that the Imperial Princess accidentally left behind a golden chelan here with Honored Lady Genie." Yonghe Hall. That was the name of a certain hall in the palace and the residence of Imperial Concubine Wei, who just so happened to be Imperial Princess Leo's mother. A shadow passed over Chu Lian's eyes. She had expected Imperial Princess Liao to send someone to demand that golden chelan back, but she really hadn't thought that the princess would resort to such a shameless tactic. She was trying to use the name of Yonghe Hall to pressure her. She wondered if Imperial Princess Liao was overestimating or underestimating her with this move. As long as He Changdi was her husband, she wouldn't be fussed with playing nice with Imperial Princess Liao. She had already offended the princess anyway. It didn't matter if she acquiesced or not now. The end result would be the same. If so, why bother giving in to the bullying? If the dear princess wanted her precious treasure back, she would have to pay the price first. Chu Lian sneered in her mind. "Oh, did something like that happen? How come I don't remember? Gonggong, your memory doesn't seem to be working too well. Is your age catching up to you?" Although Chu Lian's expression seemed friendly on the surface, her words didn't leave a single shred of mercy for the eunuch. Although the eunuch wasn't old and could even be deemed young, from the perspective of a young lady like Chu Lian who had just come of age, he was definitely much older. The eunuch flushed red in anger. As someone working in Yonghe Hall, even in the palace, excluding the servants of the Emperor and Empress Dowager, not many people dared to offend him. His face was a little contorted as he gritted his teeth and spoke, his words dropping from his mouth like stones. "Is Honored Lady Genie sure that she doesn't remember? You should think carefully. It won't be good if you offend the Imperial Concubine and Princess, right?" Chu Lian wasn't afraid of him at all. Anyway, she didn't any reason to enter the palace. Even if Imperial Concubine Wei and Imperial Princess Liao wanted to take out their anger on her, they had to come out of the palace first. TL note, Gonggong is how eunuchs are addressed. I couldn't find a good and sensible English translation for this, so I kept it in its original form. You're tuning into the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.